saying, you know, our community members, local governments in Southeast Minnesota have questions about what these impacts are. And I'm so excited that we have team members, Brigitte and Carrie, who are also here.
Bill's here.
And
Bill's here.
Where's and Bill? So who are also here because they are the ones who motivated this project to say we have questions about what are the energy and water impacts. And so that's what we seek to do is to collectively answer some of those questions over the course of this year. We're a big team, so we have localities in Southeast Minnesota as well as folks at the University of Minnesota. We are lucky to have funding from the Institute on the Environment at the university to help us do this. So as was said in the beginning, I'm Elise Harrington. I'm at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, which is our public policy school at the University of Minnesota. And so happy to be joined here by Anna and Amy, who are graduate research assistants at Humphrey School as well. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the project, what we're working towards, our timeline, a little bit what to expect, and then we're going to talk some about some early kind of discussion points from the case studies that we've been working on in this project. So what are we working towards? Our project is really grounded in thinking about what are the tools that local governments in Southeast Minnesota need, really driven by our partners on the project who are in Byron, Stewartville, and Lewiston. And we've kind of thought of these in 4 different buckets. One is thinking about a toolkit that's laying out the different pathways for data center development. So as Benya kind of talked about in the beginning, our project too is not necessarily trying to advocate for one perfect path towards data center development, but say like, hey, here's these different options that we have learned about over the course of our project, and here's a way that you have a toolkit to understand those options regarding decisions on resource use for data centers. We have a set of policy briefs that we're generating, thinking about what is that Minnesota policy landscape that is particularly salient, and what do we know about the impacts of data centers on energy and water resources that is particularly relevant for local governments. We've thought a lot about what does this mean regionally within Southeast Minnesota to talk about collaboration on this issue. And finally, engagement resources. We have a series of workshops, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. The opportunities for folks in this room beyond to engage with this project. And we will also have the resources that we come out with available to folks to use. So we have 3 components to this project. The first is what we'll be talking mostly about here today, which is learning from other places. There are many parts of the country that have a longer history of dealing with data centers, thinking about their impacts, experiencing those impacts. Well, let's take a moment to learn from those places. So we're looking at case studies in other parts of the country, both doing interviews as well as collecting other materials. Then we're going to go into a phase of kind of tailoring this information to Southeast Minnesota, thinking about what are the kinds of scenarios of data center development that are particularly important to thinking about here, and do a whole set of kind of data collection and information tailored towards here. How do we make sure we understand what's going on? And then let's have broader communication and engagement, doing workshops beyond, really thinking about engaging city administrators in these conversations, as well as broader community members. So today, I'm talking to you really kind of still situated in this learning from others phase, and we're starting to move towards this tailoring to Southeast Minnesota part. And it's here in the kind of third part of our project that we hope many of you in this room might join us in our research activities. So we're going to go in and talk a little bit about what we have learned so far from some of these case studies. And I framed it as kind of the opportunity that we've had that we're learning from both leaders in this as well as neighboring places. Maybe not always the places that you hear about with data center development, but they might have similar situations to Minnesota in terms of resources. And so that has grounded us thus far in our case studies looking at Virginia, in particular Northern Virginia. So that's the part of the country that gets lots of attention on data center development. And as well as we've done interviews and case studies focused on Iowa. Our initial learning points to kind of 3 buckets that we want to talk through with you today. The first is perhaps mentioned a little bit in the Mentimeter poll, thinking about proactive zoning, what places learn from where data centers have been cited. And infrastructure investments as opportunities for innovation, what places have shared about site infrastructure and energy and water investments, and incentives and benefits, what places have shared about attracting and benefiting from data centers. And most of this is really focused on how do we think about the tools and information that local governments might need, and how do they put together that picture of the resource demands on the one hand and the benefits that they might receive to their community on the other. And so as we kick off proactive zoning, I'm going to turn it over to Anna.
Thanks, Louise. Hi, I'm Anna. I'm going to talk a little bit about siting and proactive zoning and location of data centers. So zoning is sort of being used as a common tool for local jurisdictions to embed regulations regarding data centers, with stringency often varying based on a local community's attitude towards having data centers in their communities. So many counties provided us with insightful advice about what they wish they would have known about data centers before them entering their communities. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that from a planning and zoning perspective. These three general themes that we heard were industrial zoning, buffer zones, and overlay zones, as well as some takeaways about by right zoning, and then some takeaways about noise and aesthetics. So I'm going to run through those now. The first is industrial buffer and overlay zones. Several planning departments provided information on zoning types and sort of the principles that they wish they would have known when considering data center growth. Industrial zones is something that came up quite a bit. So planning for data centers in these zones allows for them to be sited in areas of a similar use type, ideally further from residential and community important areas. A lot of people also brought up buffer zones, so providing sort of a maximum buffer between data centers and residential areas. In a lot of the interviews in Virginia, particularly, we heard that people wish they would have sort of created proactive zoning so that data centers were further away from residences. And then also overlay zones. So planning for where you would like the data centers to be located prior to being approached by a developer is something that we heard a lot. So sort of envisioning what you would like to see and where you would like to see data centers and where you would not like to see them was sort of an important thing that we learned in some of our interviews. Next theme that we sort of identified was a shift from by right zoning to conditional use. So some jurisdictions are moving away from data center zoning by right, which allowed for development to occur too close to residential areas, and allowed data centers to be developed in areas where the community wasn't necessarily envisioning data center development. So there's been a move toward sort of conditional use or special exemption zoning, especially in some of the areas in Virginia, like Loudoun County, which has massive data center development. They've sort of moved to conditional use, which allows for increased public participation and public comment opportunities, and allows for more sort of regulatory approval, like going through the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisor approval. And then finally, on this point, we spoke with a lot of folks who were sort of seeing aesthetic and noise parameters as sort of an increasingly concerning point for citizens. So some counties are adding aesthetic and noise parameters into their zoning ordinances. So one example is Prince William County, Virginia, which includes sort of facade, design, buffer, and fencing specifications for data centers. And then Fairfax County, Virginia, which requires noise reduction and visual screening. So we're sort of seeing that be implemented into county and local zoning ordinances more frequently in places where they have a lot of data center development. And then there's also some considerations for technologies to mitigate noise and aesthetic impacts. Backup generators are a significant source of noise when they're being used, which could be replaced with other technologies, which is being talked about in the data center space, such as battery storage. But then there's also some counties that are requiring more stringent sort of parameters around what types of generators are being used. So Loudoun County is requiring tier 4 generators, which are known to be quieter and less polluting. So there's sort of some mitigation opportunities within the noise and aesthetic area as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Amy, I'm one of the GRAs. I'm gonna go over some of the needs that we're seeing, these data centers come up with that are kind of causing controversy. So they kind of need water, energy, access to fiber, lots of land, because they're large facilities, and road access, mostly for construction needs, but also some access afterwards. And these are kind of the main topics we see brought up by a lot of the municipalities that we are talking to. The sites require infrastructure upgrades most of the time. This infrastructure build-out can be a source of contention between municipalities and the developers. If they're a large enough municipality with enough of resources, they actually will use bonds to pay for this infrastructure upgrade. We see them creating special TIF districts to help pay down that bond debt afterwards. This is not necessarily applicable to smaller municipalities, so they have to be a little bit more creative in how they go about this. The infrastructure includes things like water access, energy, roads, and sometimes fiber if it's not already accessible. And there is some controversy around the water treatment capacity for some of the smaller towns as well. They do have water that is connected to municipal waterways, so you will have to deal with treating some of that water. And a couple of municipalities have to work getting close to their capacity of water treatment. So they have to consider an upgrade of the facility, and how that goes about getting paid for is something they have to negotiate. The immediate infrastructure around the site is easier to get a data developer to give some money or participate in upgrading. Anything else outside of that, such as that water treatment facility, is a little harder. And we talked a little bit about on-site backup generation. It is required. They want uninterrupted power, whether it's going to be power outages or something else. They mostly use diesel or natural gas generators. Some talk about battery backups, but we have not interviewed anybody who's using that within a data center yet. Permitting a backup generation varies a lot between states and even local municipalities, depending on certain regulations. This produces most of the noise outside of just like the generic hum when they're testing them or using them, as we talked about a little earlier. And there are some options to reuse a few things to reduce resource demands. Not a lot of it is actually being applied right now, but it's something to consider for the future. Wastewater, the centers actually don't need potable water for cooling, so they could use wastewater from other industry, but it has to be close enough to that industry to make it feasible. And they're often not building multiple centers within one spot. They kind of pair them up and then disperse them just for redundancy's sake. So it's harder to kind of locate them by other large water users in general. And then waste heat is something that has been considered, again, not in practice here in the United States, but is something that could be considered if they are located close enough to some sort of area that would be using it for heating, whether that be like a building facility for offices, or if it's close enough to residential to actually be worth spending money on that infrastructure. And then closed loop cooling is actually more common now. Most newer data centers are using this technology because they also do not want to pay for a lot of water. So they're using this as a way to reduce their water use. And once they actually fill up the system, they pull very little water from the system. So they're not paying as much in water fees and using as much water capacity as they have in the past.
Okay, I will just close us out with the last kind of theme, thinking about kind of the incentives and agreements. And we really asked about these questions to think about what are the multiple dimensions that municipalities and counties are thinking about as they're trying to balance these resource questions. And so this figure is from Loudoun County, Virginia. That's the kind of area in Northern Virginia that's considered Data Center Alley. It's a very high concentration of data centers. And so you can see from this kind of a substantial growth in tax revenue from data centers. So the county reports that they have kind of 39% of their tax revenue is from data centers on just 3% of their land. So it is a very high value kind of industry for them. And what you can also see is the difference in this figure between what they have as real property versus computer equipment or personal property. And that personal property revenue is about 65 to 70%. And that is I think really grounding this conversation for them about the kind of benefits that they have locally from data center development. Jurisdictions describe that this kind of revenue is able to cushion them from other kinds of impacts to their tax base, other changes on things like commercial property or needs to increase residential taxes. But there was a pretty big message that we heard across interviewees, which is don't give away too much. That localities are in the driver's seat because there is demand for data centers. And so be really careful about these kind of agreements that you make such that you are able to have a discussion about a positive kind of tax revenue situation. So the kinds of incentives, what do they look like? The most common things we heard of were tax exemptions and abatements, the kinds of infrastructure investments that Amy talked about, that they're the ones responsible for that. That's what they're bringing to the table. And some cases of a franchise fee rebate, so franchise fees that actually go through the electric utility, then being rebated back to a developer. The other kind of range of benefits that you will hear in return, and I'll just go through this quickly because I know you're going to hear much more about this later, were things like community betterment payments. Some of those were specified in development agreements. So X number of dollars per building over a certain period of time. Others were much more ad hoc. Here's kind of the agreement we're making for a particular fund. There are investments in community needs or amenities. Housing was mentioned. One-time or emergency support funds. So in Northern Virginia, there's been a lot of changes in their kind of employment in the last few years. And so making sure that there's been some emergency support funds and education and training programs, in particular those where the local community colleges or trade schools have come together with the data center developers to offer new data center programs like data center operations. This was grounded by a message we heard of defining what is important to your community to be able to include what kinds of benefits should go into these kinds of agreements. So the issues that we continue to think about, as I said, we're kind of still in our early phases of this project. And we're still thinking a lot about what are the key areas of local government action versus what might need to happen at the state level. So one question that came up, for example, for us in interviews was, well, if we need more information on something like water or energy, should a municipality be asking for that, or should that go to the state level? So there's some things that we're still thinking about like how do we disentangle what is right for what we're learning from these case studies that guides local government action versus higher levels. And how do we do things like link community concerns, like Anna talked about noise and aesthetics, with ways to think about mitigating energy and water resources. So that could be things about how we're thinking about those being connected to backup generators or connected to the ways that you might reuse heat. Does it have kind of benefits in lots of these different ways? And so those are some of the questions that are driving us as we go forward. And I just thought I would remind everyone that where we are headed, we have a few gaps that we would like to fill in our case studies as we continue to go on. There's been lots of discussion about excitement for thinking about energy innovation, and actually not a lot of examples from our case studies so far. So that's one that we would really like to fill that gap in. And make sure that we're continually thinking about places that are comparable in their dynamics to Minnesota. And then next, we're going to be thinking about how we identify development scenarios specific to Southeast Minnesota, do activities like water modeling, interviews with regional stakeholders. We're going to start to narrow in. And then later in the spring, have our kind of workshops, and we're excited for hopefully many of you to join us for those. So I'll just put another little QR code plug up here that if you would like to stay informed on this project, you can go to this QR code, and we have a little survey that you can fill out. It gives you an opportunity to learn more about our events, join a list that we're pulling together for making sure you are all informed about what our next steps are. We're really excited to share this with you today and know that this is our first step in what we hope is a kind of way to really help support the region with this research. So I will turn it back to Ben. Yeah. Brenda. I will turn it back to Brenda. And thank you all so much for your time.
I am very excited about the work that they're doing, especially when I know now that it's not that far away. It should be focusing on southeast Minnesota. I love it. And our cities will be very appreciative of your work with us. All right, we're gonna move to the Data Center 101 energy and water impacts. And I'll call up Tricia Sia. She's civil engineer and vice president at Kinley Horn. Carrie Jennings, research and policy director at Freshwater. By the way, freshwater is one word. One word. We're gonna make sure people know that so that if you need to look it up online, you'll know. Don't put a space in it. All right, Catherine Nuschler from the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board. All right. Now, these folks are going to give a presentation of 15 minutes each, 15 to 20. We'll call it 15 to 20. And just so that you folks know, when now I'm going to give you the full 20. When you get to the 18 mark, I'm going to give you a 2, 19, and then 20 is a capital. All right. I'm a former teacher. Anyways, after that, there will be time for Q&A. So don't think that, oh, all the time is used up. No, we set aside a specific amount of time for Q&A, and I'll make sure you get them. All right, let's go ahead and start with Tricia. You get your time right now.
Slides are down here.
Either way.
However you're comfortable. Up there and then I can come through. All right, hello everybody. I am Trish C. I'm a practicing civil engineer with Kinley Horn, so a local firm to Minnesota. And I've been practicing for about 20 years, and particularly on the data center front, I did my first data center project in 2012. So in the spectrum of the industry, it's a fairly long time, 14 years now, and I've had the pleasure of working on small projects, big projects, edge, co-location data centers. We'll go over what all these are in a minute, all the way to hyperscale and working directly for the end users versus the developer. So a very broad spectrum of experience that I can draw on. So I'm gonna dive in, and I have a lot of information. I could probably talk for hours on this, so I'm gonna try to go through the slides relatively fast. Again, we've got time for Q&A. Data centers are not a simple topic, right? So I'm going to try to give you as much information as I can in a digestible manner. So let's start about what they are. Do you use your smartphone? Do you use your computer? Any connectivity to your car? Almost everything we do in our waking hour is going through a data center. It's really quite alarming. So these are very basic things that we would do in our day-to-day, as far as Googling information online, using email, accessing your banks online. So those are relatively basic. But then societally wise, things like national security. I was even surprised several years ago to learn my mom had open heart surgery and some follow-up surgeries. Those were robotic, right? Those are going through a data center. So we want to make sure that that information and that connectivity is not lost. EMS 9/11 response, and then machine learning for medical breakthroughs. I've got some examples if we want to talk more on that. But to summarize it, they are really the nodes of our modern day digital highway, the backbone of almost everything we do on a daily basis, and really pivotal to have a good network of data centers in our country. There is also a lot of false information out in the world, or outdated. The data centers we're building today are very different than what was built 20 years ago, what was built 10, even 5 years ago, even a few years ago. So there's a lot of either wrong or outdated information out there. So hopefully today we can get you some, correct information from, again, seeing these over the last 14 years or so. A little more technically, as far as what a data center is, it houses servers and chips, right? It's rows and rows of essentially like computer servers. They do require redundant backup power supplies, communication connections. They're highly secure, and they're 24/7 facilities. Data doesn't stop. And even more simply put, they're the cloud. Oh, it's on the cloud somewhere. No, it's in the data center. Okay, so now to get a layer deeper, what different types of data centers. So co-location is where a company may lease part of or a row of servers within a broader hosted data center. There's a lot of these in Minnesota. There has been for 2 or 3 decades.
And they're in Minneapolis, they're in the suburbs, they're all across the state. Enterprise is before, if a bank builds their own data centers for a company. Hyperscale is a lot of what we'll talk about today, and by the name, big scale, there's not a specific cutoff, but generally I would say more than 100 megawatts would be a hyperscale. Often it's a campus, multiple buildings. An edge data center is smaller, it's closer to population densities. It's for the low latency of needing to pull information really quick. So for a lot of companies, there's a lot of these in downtown Minneapolis around any city center. And then there's a lot of other, just I would say, underground experimental data centers, evolving very quickly. So how else can we apply these? Where can we put them? What works, what doesn't, etc. So again, the hyperscale that's got the asterisk, that's where we're going to spend most of our time, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So as far as what they really need, I like to look at it in kind of 5 areas. And that's power, number 1, fiber, I would say number 2, water, I would classify as sometimes, and we'll talk more on that. They also need a good jurisdictional partner, and then a workable site and trade area. Kind of self-explanatory, but the site has to lend itself and it has to make sense to put it there. And then there has to be enough local support, not only for construction jobs, but for operational jobs as well. We are not going to have time today to talk about kind of all these related or like common impacts and questions, which are the boxes kind of surrounding this graphic. I'm going to try to hit on a few of them. But these are, what we most often hear responding to help educate about data centers. So first for power, yes, this is increasing significantly. Just a few stats and numbers. 2023 data centers accounted for about 4.5% of the total electricity used in the US. That is going to double or triple by 2028. There's a lot going on here, but to focus your attention on the pie chart, the darker red is data centers. And you can see that overall, this is electricity growth. While they are getting a lot of attention and they are growing and they are needing more electricity, it still is a relatively small piece of the pie in terms of the other industries and other demands for electricity. Sticking on power, from how much power does a data center need? Well, that's a very open-ended answer. I'll classify it to 10 megawatts on the low side for like an edge data center, all the way up to 1,000 or multiples of thousands for a large hyperscale campus. From a power standpoint, they are often and now legislatively driven in Minnesota to be a separate rate classification to ensure to the ratepayers that they are not going to negatively impact their rates. So kept in their own bucket per se. In my experience with all the projects, they've always paid their own way with grid improvements. As most of you know, our grid is fairly antiquated since its initial build out. 60-ish years ago, right? Like there's a lot of improvements that need to be made, and this is a investment in kind of an infusion of money that is able to help make some of them, not all of them, but it's able to actually help strengthen the grid in a lot of ways. So that's how I kind of position it from grid strain is how people think about it, but really there's a lot of grid strength and advantages to having them help with some of the improvements. There's other grid stability in the blue box on the bottom. Things like demand response, on-site energy storage that was mentioned earlier about like the BESS battery energy storage systems, and on-site generation is being explored more and more and more because there is a demand for electrons that aren't there right now. So this is being explored much more often now. I also do want to note that from a kind of broad spectrum from renewable advancements, the tech companies that are behind most of these data centers, they are really the key catalyst of the renewable energy growth, so a lot of the wind and the solar and the BESS that has come online and is going to be coming online, is somehow tied to them, right? And so the investment is actually really helping advance that renewable energy and away from coal sources. Okay, I'm gonna shift to water. So not all data centers need water for cooling. That is one very huge misconception out there that, oh my God, they need a ton of water, they can take out water. And in fact, that is becoming even further from the truth as technology advances in the cooling system. The closed loop cooling system was mentioned earlier. That is very correct. That is much more prevalent these days, probably the most prevalent type of cooling system. And this could be a whole couple of day session in itself. So I'm going to try to boil this down and walk you through this graphic a little bit. But on the left of kind of that sliding scale on the top, you've got like an air-cooled air conditioning unit. So think, giant air conditioning units for a very big building that these servers get quite hot, right? So it's got to pump out a lot of cool air and suck out the warm air. And then you move one slot over to a closed loop with dry coolers or air-cooled chillers. A little bit more efficient, quite a bit more efficient, actually, I should say. And both of these two, you will still need some water to the data center, but that's domestic portable water, right? For your toilets, your sinks, stuff like that. So that is a relatively very low demand. And I have some comparisons here in a second. And then moving over to the kind of third category, the direct evaporative cooling is sort of a hybrid system, if you want to think about it that way. So it uses more water than a closed loop system, but less than the full like water cooled chillers. And the water cooled chillers are, if you think about like cooling towers that you see water streaming down, those do take the most water. That's what I think comes into people's head when they think data centers, but in my experience, and maybe nowadays there might be spitball this 1 out of every 30 data centers is even considering that, right? And that's in some more unique conditions where you've got a freshwater, surface water source where you might be able to use it and return it. So these are becoming more and more obsolete in the industry. The arrow below it is indicating power. So if you did use a lot of water, you would use less power for cooling. Using no water, you use more power. So from an engineering standpoint, where it ends up always being the $1 million question is, where do you strike that balance? And that's based on the locality, based on, what you're surrounded by, a lot of factors that go into that, your temperature, weather patterns, wind, so it's a complicated, it's not a simple answer to say, well, we're going to be, but all of the data center end users and all of us engineers that are working for them, we are always trying to optimize this and make this as efficient as possible. So I think that's the most on that slide. So to have some comparative numbers on periods, now this is taken like per 100 megawatt block. A closed loop system is roughly equivalent to what 10 houses use. Okay, so it's not a lot at all. Again, that's more that's domestic. The closed loop system, after the initial fill, hardly any water is used. So that's vast majority just your toilets, your sinks, etc. Direct evaporative cooling, again, same 100 megawatt block, would use roughly equivalent to 3.5 car wash facilities. From a water sustainability standpoint, I put some examples from some of the 4 main end users that everybody's has heard of or knows. And they've got really aggressive goals to be water positive, to replenish more water than they use. So they're putting a lot of focus in trying to, kind of strengthen the water picture, knowing that it is a valuable resource. So they take that very seriously too. They're not trying to just use as much water as they possibly can. An example, we're as engineers too, we're always looking at how can we reuse water. Water used from wastewater treatment plants was mentioned earlier. That is something that we look at very often. We're always looking at how can we have this water circularity going on. This is one example from, and this is a fairly, simple representation of if it was a direct evaporative cooling, you know, some of the water is going to be absorbed in that process, but what isn't absorbed, roughly a third of it, can be infiltrated back into the ground. I'm gonna move on a little bit and kind of wrap up or go up a level into just environmental precautions and permitting overall. These projects are big, they are giant investments, you know, often in the billions of dollars. There's a lot of diligence that is done. There are also a lot of coordination that we have with different state and federal agencies. So this is, and I know you're not going to be able to read all this. This is more, and I'll explain what I'm trying to get at here, but that there, for every aspect you can think about from a data center development, I guarantee you, especially in Minnesota, there is an agency or a department, permitting authority, et cetera, that has jurisdiction over that, right? That the project is going to be coordinating with and working with. The bottom ribbon is an example, this is up in the metro area, but an example of a data center project and the different components and the different both federal, local, state agencies, departments, authorities that we would be working with, right? So on this example, there's 30-ish different departments and agencies that we would work through and coordinate with in the process of a project. So there are a lot of checks and balances, a lot of regulatory oversight for anything like this. So to kind of wrap it up, then, you know, there is a lot of really strong benefits that data centers do bring to a community. I'll dial through these quick. There's one slide for each of them, but economic development, I want to put an asterisk with a low burden on services. So they will bring a strong tax base, but they don't bring a ton of traffic. They don't have a lot of 911 and fire calls that they need to respond to. They will bring some kids to the local schools, but they're not going to bring thousands like a manufacturing plant would that would, you know, require new schools to be built, stuff like that. So they actually have a very low burden when they're operational, but yet have a very high tax benefit. There's some Loudoun County information that they found they were 26-to-1 as far as they pay $26 in taxes for every $1 in local public services that they use. Jobs. This one also is a lot of different information across the board. There is no doubt a ton of construction jobs, a lot of construction jobs, and those can be anywhere from, you know, 2 to 10 years for a build out. So they're like long-term construction jobs. They do have a moderate to lower, is how I would classify it, operating jobs. But they're good, high-paying jobs. And with that, this kind of jumps into the second bullet of there's actually a really strong multiplier, you know, so while there might be a low to moderate amount of jobs at the data center when it's operating, there's found to be in a lot of studies a 6-to-1 multiplier, that there's for every 1 direct data center job, there's 6-ish that are created or induced from it. Really strong community partnerships, and I can really vouch for this from working on a lot of projects and seeing how they come in and how they want to partner with the community, help, you know, whether it's local schools or stream cleanups or, you know, where like they know that they have the ability to make a positive impact, so they're looking at how can they do that. And then we talked a little bit about the infrastructure from a power standpoint, but even infrastructure from a water and sewer standpoint. If they're build outs to the site, again, they're almost always driven, or they're almost always paid for by the developer, by the end user. And that has a lot of benefits for other members of the community as well, and even, you know, opening areas up for future development, other development. So that is what I have. So that's a lot of information. Thanks for staying with me.
Who's asking about the slides for share?
Will be shared with everyone by email and online.
All right, email and online.
We'll announce it.
I think I'll announce it right now. The slides
shared.
And you'll get them both by email and online.
Right, email and online, the slides will be shared. My name is Carrie Jennings. I'm going to talk to you about not just data centers, but other high volume water users and the geologic considerations that should probably be made in site selection. First of all, you might not have heard of freshwater unless you get our weather guide calendar, but we are engaged in water research and policy, and then outreach and engagement and education. And what we do is try to connect and communicate across different silos and sectors in state and increasingly across the Great Lakes. And our data center work and large volume water user work is Great Lakes wide. What we saw evolving in the last 2-3 years was that the speed of business was exceeding the speed of policy development in the region, and that Minnesota and other Great Lakes states like Illinois were becoming targets for water intensive industries, including biofuel production, green hydrogen, and bottling facilities. Over 20 cities alone in Minnesota were approached last year for data center development. And the decisions tended to move very quickly, often with the city signing a non-disclosure agreement early on. So the permitting path that was mentioned earlier, where all of the agencies get involved, was actually bypassed in this direct city approach. So we started hearing from cities that it was confusing array of cities in the state unless you looked at the data center infrastructure, and that is the network of electric grid and fiber capacity. And if you zoom in on that in the Twin Cities area, all of the stars were places where the high voltage power lines were intersecting fiber networks. And that's where we were hearing from people, Hampton, Cannon Falls, and Farmington and Lakeville, Becker. It only made sense when you looked at this map. So there's this tension here that I think everybody recognizes, that we want to balance economic development with the need to ensure that future communities have access to water and other resources. So the typical development process in the last year was that DEED, our Employment and Economic Development state level agency, was working with regional economic developers to find places where cities could be accepting of these industries. So the cities were then approached directly by the industry. This is when the non-disclosure agreements were commonly signed. And they were looking again at these places where fiber and power were adequate. The agreements were reached before they went public. And then that's when the city understood what was happening, and often the rural residents surrounding the city that were not connected to the utilities. And that's usually where you got these negative reactions with packed city council meetings that went on for hours, and sometimes citizen groups forming that started lawsuits. So this bypassed the state regulatory process, and the possible adverse outcomes with this approach are that the rural well owners, private well owners, might have well interference complaints from the city increasing their pumping. There might be increased water rates, other environmental impacts that weren't considered because the experts at the state level weren't consulted on these things, or even a county level. And then the city could potentially be saddled with expensive infrastructure if they hadn't gone in eyes wide open with these community benefit agreements in mind. There is some statute language that you should be aware of in Minnesota. We have some of the best laws around groundwater, especially in the EPA Region 5, that's from here to Ohio, because we have a priority for when the water becomes scarce, if there is a drought. We say that domestic water supplies and power producers that have contingency plans will always have first dibs on the water. And secondly, small water users, those that use less than 10 gallons a day, 10,000 gallons a day. And then we prioritize agricultural irrigation and processing of ag products as third, and then power production without approved contingency plans. And then we allow excess, other uses in excess of 10,000 gallons. So this is where the other large water users would come in. And finally, non-essential uses of water, which in my mind might be something like snowmaking or car washes or something like that. So in this priority of use, large water users are fifth. So that the DNR has recently told the city of Upland Market, who has a water bottling plant, that it's their job in a drought to make sure that Niagara water bottling is turned off before the domestic users. which is a little problematic because they're hooked up to the municipal water supplies. I don't think there's a special valve that goes to Niagara. So just understand that in the most recent determination by the DNR, they decided this is a city responsibility to enforce this statute. So the issues that we see are that these projects are moving faster than planners can react. Cities probably need to share data among themselves in the region, need some tools to look at kind of the long-term water supply for the region. These short-term incentives are easier to think about than long-term water sustainability. We have a planner that works with us that wants you to think on 100-year timelines. That's just 3 generations, but it is kind of hard for a city council member to think about 3 generations. We also don't see much community engagement in these concurrent processes. And there's a lot of stakeholders involved, which makes being proactive a challenge anyway. So because I'm a geologist, I think everything starts with what's under your feet because that's what you can't change. And I think that we should be asking certain questions like, what is the distribution of usable groundwater? And I'm talking about, again, all large water users. You probably saw the ethanol boom 20 years ago, and the green hydrogen boom and the other biofuels boom will also be water intensive industries coming our way. Thanks to not the glaciers necessarily, which is the thickness of glacial deposits are on the left, but thanks to the inland seas that once covered this region, we have groundwater in southeast Minnesota that we don't even think about. Our well driller can usually sink a well anywhere in these colored counties in southeastern Minnesota and find adequate water for a domestic user, and maybe even somebody larger than a domestic user. These are stacks of limestone and sandstone with some shale in between. And I could go way into detail on this for how continuous these layers are. I won't because I'm still short in the geology bit. But the seas came in and out for a long time. And first you get the beaches, and then you get the slightly muddy water offshore from the beaches, and then you get the carbonate platform like you see in the Bahamas. And then the seas go out and you get the reverse sequence. So we end up with actually a seaway centered on Mower County, a deeper part of the ocean centered on Mower County called the Galena Basin. And over the years, this basin, Minnesota's tilted on its side right here because during the formation of these different levels, we started off south of the equator down by Brazil and slowly moved north. So this was, very tropical for a long time. If the area ever was exposed, not covered by a seaway, then you got erosional periods. And then finally, we had much, much later a seaway that was covering this part of the area with dinosaurs walking along the shores and sharks swimming in it and turtles. And this was a seaway that extended essentially from the middle of the Rockies over to eastern Minnesota. So what that ends up looking like in Mower County is a stack, and you can see the colored stack on the right. But then you can see that there's different layers. There's a little frosting left in some areas, but then you're seeing different layers of the cake as you go down. And that's because there have been these periods of exposure and erosion. So you end up with a pretty complicated story in Mower County in this general area with only these parts of the rock record left. All of the missing column areas that aren't colored in are gaps in the record. And then the areas that are blue are the primary places where your well driller is going down in to find the water. This is all covered, of course, by the glacial sediment, and that's thicker in the middle part of the county where it's kind of purplish gray. The rock is close to the surface under Austin, and then as you go east into southeastern Minnesota, it gets more inland exposed. So the blue and the purple colors in this map are where the glacial sediment is thicker. You can think of that as protection for the groundwater. You're going to have to drill through some gray clay before you get to these rock layers, but it's probably a water source that's more protected. So the story about your groundwater, it's here, it's complicated, it varies even across the county. And I'm not talking about I'm not giving you the details I gave Mankato or Spring Grove because they have different stories for their groundwater. So how do we know what's here? Well, this map, which you can barely see, has little dots all over it. These are the driller's records of your well logs. And there's also some test holes that have been drilled. And those are in a statewide database. This is very useful for the geologists who are trying to reconstruct what is down there. And it also helps us understand different things about the chemistry of the water and just water levels in wells. And in fact, the DNR also has the orange dots are places where DNR has a dedicated well in the ground that's measuring water levels over time and how they change with different precipitation and also use situations. We have a lot of monitoring wells. We're lucky. The rest of the region doesn't have nearly as many. Poor Michigan has no idea what's going on underground. So DNR monitors this, and they're also the ones that issue the appropriation permits for your cities. They dedicate a certain amount for you for 10-year comp plans, and then they also allow other large industrial users to get permits. More detail, we know which way the groundwater flows, we kind of know how old it is. In the Austin area, it's kind of interesting because you actually have some faults that have offset the beds and that have allowed young water, which is pink, to mix with the old water, which is blue, and create the zone where we know that there's surface contamination getting down into the bedrock aquifers. These are studies that have been done by the Minnesota Geological Survey and the Department of Natural Resources. Let me go fast. One of the reasons you have young water getting to the subsurface in other parts of Mower County is because you have sinkholes. They're not super obvious here, not certainly as obvious as they are as you go east, but in the Austin area, you have sinkholes and also down by Leroy. This is pointer word. So Austin, can you see the little dots here? There's dots here, and then there's a whole bunch of dots in this part of the county. I think this makes them show up better. If you see the little tiny divots, the little tiny pimples, there's some in here. They don't look like much on the surface. There's a fairly large one, some over here. But those are places where surface water goes straight down into the bedrock through these holes. And because of the long period of exposure of the rock, a lot of it is more fractured at the surface because it was exposed when this part of the continent was at the equator, so you had a lot of deep weathering. So there's just places that are more vulnerable to surface water exchange. As you go farther east in Minnesota, you get into this area, this quasi-driftless terrain or the deep valleys and the bluffs. There we have a very different situation of a close network of springs that are moving from the surface to the valley walls. So know that the state level agencies and the University of Minnesota, the Geological Survey, have this kind of information, and it's good to understand that and how your city fits into this story. The other questions that are asked about groundwater might be, how is it replenished? It's really just a bank account that's replenished by rain these days. Some of this water in the Mankato area is older than the last interglacial period, it's 60,000 years old. Some of the water near the surface in Spring Grove is only 30 years old. Here, you're probably somewhere in between, and you're just gaining income now from the rain as it's coming across this part of the state, if it's allowed to sit at the surface and soak in. We know that those rainfall patterns are changing with climate change. We're getting more intense rain events, maybe longer drought periods, the flash droughts we see. We don't know what recharge will look like in the future for these bedrock aquifers, but it's probably not best to look at this as an average annual precipitation, which is what these are showing, because it's really how intense the rainfall is and how it's soaking in, as opposed to running off. It's the important variable. Other concerns about high volume water users are that if you're pumping hard on a well that is in your city, you're drawing water in from farther away. Your drinking water supply management area, or your DWSMA, is basically just an outline of someone's best guess of a 10-year flow field to your well. If you start pumping more, that expands in area. So some of the other questions about increased pumping are, what are we pumping in besides water? There are maps that the Pollution Control Agency has of where the underground pollution is, where the contaminated sites are. You could potentially be drawing those into your municipal supply area if you start pumping a lot more. And then you can also potentially mobilize constituents that are part of the geology that are already there. And these include, in this part of the state, manganese and arsenic. I should just mention one thing about farther southeast in Minnesota, a lot of the near surface water above that old line is contaminated with nitrates and other agricultural contaminants. So those potentially could be mobilized during the pumping, and they can even be sucked farther down. If you have a deep well and you're creating a drain on those lower aquifers, you can bring that contamination deeper. I would urge you, if you're thinking about manganese and arsenic, we are running a series of well testing clinics. We had one in Fairmont on a very cold day on December. But there's going to be a few more in the area because we do know that this part of Minnesota has a fairly high arsenic. So when I talk to people across the Great Lakes region about where would you put, let's say, the demands of a medium city, 300,000, maybe that's not medium, maybe that's big for this part of the state. But if you look at how population is distributed across the Great Lakes region, population centers are on the Great Lakes or on the Great Rivers. And that's because those are sustainable sources of water in part. I'm sure transportation plays into this, but the farther you get away from a Great Lakes or a surface water body, the less likely you are going to be able to sustain a large water user on groundwater alone. So I would caution large water users locating in places where there's a mix of private wells with the municipal well. We're seeing well interference issues on the outskirts of the metropolitan area, far from water sources like the Great Lakes, areas that don't have the bedrock aquifers that you do, but that's not relevant here, or areas that have seasonal water scarcity. And mainly this is because during water scarcity in the summer, you're going to see increased irrigation. And I know there's irrigation along the Cedar River kind of sand plain, and that it's already impacting lake levels and river levels along the Cedar River. And then I would also urge caution against locating large water users where you know there's sinkholes, because sinkholes that are water filled are stable and are supporting the cave roof. Sinkholes that are drained will have less support and can collapse and create a surface issue. So other questions that should be asked is, what are the societal priorities for groundwater? And this is the biggest missing piece, I think, in the conversation so far. What do your residents think? You know, mostly we're hearing from these hyper-local organizations that are mobilizing against data centers. And they're doing this in part because the process has not been transparent or inclusive and has led to their fear of distrust. Perpetuating environmental justice issues potentially. And when they don't have a governance pathway or an input, then they're going to go through the legal system or the media. And maybe they'll initiate a formal environmental review process or protest. But if you start with these inclusive bottom-up practices, you're less likely to need to redo anything later or be sued. I'm going to go fast because they talked about this and just say that alternatives to using groundwater, we would love to see more surface water used, including artificially impounded bodies of water like mine pit lakes and reclaimed water from wastewater, dewatering from quarries. Currently, this is a really fraught permitting path at the state level. It's hard to get a firm coming into your area to do this because it requires permits from all of the different agencies. The DNR, because it starts with the PCA if the water hits the roof or the road, because now it's potentially polluted. The DNR, because now it's a water of the state if it's in a pond. The DNR and the Department of Health, if you do anything with it that contacts people because it could have Legionella or something in it. And then the Department of Labor and Industry, if you're piping it indoors because they control the plumbing code. This has only been done a handful of times in the state. We don't have a clear path for companies to do this. So if we fix that, we could potentially see a lot more water reuse. So we think that the state agencies could make groundwater data available to guide businesses to areas with sustainable water. Planners could be sharing tools across the region. Cities could be consulting stakeholders, frontline communities, and states could incentivize that circular water design and require transparency and water reporting. And the Attorney General could make sure that we're enforcing that law that's already on the books. Just one final thing, planners in the region, you already have a tool. You have a one watershed blend plan for the Cedar Wassapinigan River that was done in 2019 that talks about groundwater, and you could use this tool for your regional planning efforts. And finally, we're gonna have a water risk atlas and a beta product in a year that helps you understand all of the potential risk factors. Thank you.
See if I can manage the mic, my paper isn't clicking. All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Catherine Nuschler. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board, or the EQB. We're a small state agency that serves as a forum for leadership and coordination on environmental issues. And our mission is to support informed decision-making that protects and enhances Minnesota's environmental quality. So among our key roles that are important to the discussion of data centers is we work to support state policy and program development on emerging environmental issues, and relevant to some of the questions I already saw in the Mentimeter, we work to maintain and improve Minnesota's environmental review program. So we have an administrative role over that program, and the staff provide technical assistance. So sort of why are we here? I think Trish and Carrie really did a great job framing up the issue in terms of thinking about how did we get to this place where we're having these discussions about data centers. As Trish said, we've had data centers for a long time, but I think they are, they're different. They're qualitatively and quantitatively different today than they were, as she noted. And as Carrie noted, we have many state regulatory programs, particularly environmental ones, that may well apply to data centers, but they weren't crafted with data centers in mind. Very few of them are specific to that, and so they don't necessarily say, hey, you're a data center, do that. So kind of with that lack of alignment, or sort of that sort of degree of catch up that the state regulatory programs are doing, there have been and continues to be a lot of discussions about the laws and the regulations related to data centers, whether they need to change, what might need to be adapted to fit to data centers, or what new data center regulations might be needed. Some of the topics that I heard discussed during the last legislative session in 2025, most of which had at least a bill introduced around them, included the sales tax exemption that's available to qualified data centers, zoning, environmental permitting, water use, energy use, including impacts to Minnesota's climate goals, electricity prices, and environmental review. I'm going to give a brief summary of what was completed during this session and was included in the data center bill. But I'm not an expert on all of these things, so you can go look it up and ask the agencies in charge if you need more detail. So the bill that passed in 2025 included provisions defining a quote large-scale qualified data centers, made modifications to the sales tax exemption that was available to those bills, or I'm sorry, to those centers, and required prevailing wages. Related to environmental permitting, it directed interagency coordination among the state agencies happened through a program called Minnesota Business First Stop that's housed at DEED, or the Department of Employment and Economic Development. And it requires the Pollution Control Agency, the DNR, Department of Health, and the Board of Water and Soil Resources to refer any inquiries on data centers they get to that Minnesota Business First Stop program, which has been around for about 15 years and tries to coordinate the agencies for environmental permitting on large projects. The bill also set out a pre-application evaluation of water use. It's voluntary, but DNR can evaluate water use for data centers that will consume more than 100 million gallons a year. So DEED's starting to work on some permitting checklists, and DNR has out, I think, some of their pre-application evaluation tools for water. On the energy side, there was work to help contain costs from electricity use. I think Trish noticed this. The Public Utilities Commission is supposed to establish a very large customer class for the investor-owned utilities that provide electric service to ensure that the costs attributable to serving those large customers are paid by those large customers. And then there's other protections for non-data center customers. And I think the electricity provided is required to meet the Minnesota's carbon-free standard. In addition, the data centers have to certify that they've attained a green building or sustainable design standard, and they need to pay an annual fee to Commerce based on their peak demand. So that was some of the stuff that happened. So while there was a lot done, one of the areas where ultimately no changes passed was environmental review. So environmental review for these facilities is being done through existing frameworks. And since this is our program, I'm going to give you an overview here, but it is complex as we have been talking about. So the environmental review program in Minnesota, and it is unique. Minnesota is one of only 16 states that has a state level environmental review program. It's grounded in a law passed in 1973 called the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act, which is in Minnesota Statute 116D. And then the implementing rules, the regulations that lay out the process and the requirements are all in Minnesota Rule 4410. And again, those statutes and those rules, they don't say the word data center in them anywhere, but that doesn't mean that they don't apply or that they're not being used. The environmental review program is meant to identify the potential for significant environmental effects. So the grounding framework is that any project that may have the potential for significant environmental effects needs to go through environmental review. The information gathered is meant to be holistic, done early in the process, and is meant to inform permit and project decisions, particularly decisions around the mitigations of environmental effects. And it's designed to support public participation. It's not an approval process. There's nothing that says, well, this project has environmental effects, so we can't do it. That's not the way the program works. It is information gathering. But it does place a moratorium on permits until that information gathering is complete. In the program, it has established objectives, again, for information, for public awareness and public participation, and also to delegate the authority and the responsibility for the review to the governmental unit most closely involved in the process. And I think this is really important for those of you at local government. If you're the ones with the most permits, you're the governmental authority that is closest to the project. Just to sort of talk briefly, the environmental review program kind of has two tracks, for lack of a better term. Our standard process is the one that's in 4410, which is administered by the EQB, and it includes all the information and procedures and review. But the rules recognize that in some cases, different procedures might work better. One alternative that's specifically laid out is one you've probably heard of, the AUAR, or the Alternative Urban Area-Wide Review Process. And that is spelled out in 4410, and EQB does administer that. But the other one is Public Utility Commission processes for permitting and reviewing energy projects. And so I'm just going to take a brief hop over to the PUC processes, which I'm not an expert in. But environmental review is required under these processes for certain kinds of energy projects. So power generation of all types, including wind and solar, battery storage, high voltage transmission lines, and all of these things. So data centers that have on-site energy generation may need to go through some of these processes. So they're mentioned in 4410, but the details are all in the Minnesota Energy Infrastructure Permitting Act, which was just passed in 2024. But at a high level, they need to go through this review if there's a site permit or a route permit needed. And the review might vary depending on the size of the project and the specific project type. So there's different kinds of review. They just got consolidated in 2024. I think everyone's still working through that process. But there is PUC processes that are important for energy. Back to kind of the main part that EQB oversees. The main processes that people are mostly familiar with are the EAW, or Environmental Assessment Worksheet, or the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement. The EAW is meant to be a brief document setting out the effects. There's 22 questions, it's a form, it's filled out kind of the same way by everybody. The EIS is more complex and detailed, it includes alternatives analysis, and again, looking at that environmental effects and mitigation. And then we have that alternative urban area-wide review, which I will get into more of the details of. In general, you're going through environmental review, you're answering questions and providing information about the project and its impacts in multiple areas. Greenhouse gas emissions, land cover and land use, water resources, all that stuff Carrie was talking about. What's your geology? How much water is there? How does it impact people if you pump too much water? All of that kind of stuff, hazardous waste, ecological communities. And then also something called cumulative potential effects. So this project that's under review and all of the other projects that might be happening in the area. What happens if you look at them all together? So then what drives environmental review? When do you have to do it? One of the core features of the rule is something called the mandatory categories. So environmental review is required when the project is defined by a mandatory category and the extent of the project described meets or exceeds the threshold that's in our rules. That might be acreage, it might be amount of climate emissions, it might be the square footage of a warehouse. And there's triggers in the rules for EAWs and EISs. There's also processes for discretionary review. And I would emphasize this for the local governments, that any government that has the authority to permit a project has the ability to order review. If that project has the potential for significant, or may have the potential for significant environmental effects based on its nature, based on its location, based on its understanding. There's a few limitations to this, but you can't do review for a project that's already been through review. But particularly if you are the first governmental unit to act, you can make the decision to order a review subject to whatever your government's internal decision-making processes are. And also you can make the decision about what format and what procedures to use. So just because you can use alternative processes like the AUAR doesn't mean that you have to. Just a couple of examples of mandatory categories that exist and that could be applicable to data centers. And just kind of so you see what the structure is here. The category defines the project, often it's construction of something, expansion of something, building of something, and a size, whether that's megawatts of power, gross floor space of a warehouse. And then it also will define which governmental unit does the review. So these are just a couple of examples. There's many, many, many categories, but I just pulled out a few so you can kind of see what they look like. And then once you have the EAW, when the EAW is complete, the responsible governmental unit needs to make a decision on whether an EIS is needed. So it is supposed to be done. You move to an EIS if there is a potential for significant environmental effects based on the decision criteria that are shown on this slide. So that's one of the key features as well. An EAW can proceed to an EIS. All right. One of the specific substitute environmental review procedures is the AUAR. It is designed to look at the potential environmental effects from anticipated projects within a defined geographic area. Generally, we see these AUARs when cities or counties are looking to evaluate potential impacts from development-based land use designations within a comprehensive plan. And that comprehensive plan is really the key thing. You have to have one to be able to use this process. That's really the important factor, not do you consider yourself urban. So the process reviews development scenarios, at least one of which has to align with the comprehensive plan, so that the range of potential scenarios in a geographic area can be looked at holistically and during the planning process. So it's a planning tool, but it also can act as a substitute for an EAW or an EIS for certain projects that occur later that align with the development scenarios. Those project types are limited to residential, commercial, warehousing, and light industrial development. And so really this is the sense of you're moving from development scenarios and kind of a more general planning to finding the specific projects that are going to develop within your geographic area. So you may have reviewed a scenario with a certain amount of residential development, and now you have the actual proposal to build X number of homes in this part of the geographic area. But it's really important to note that if a project is proposed that triggers a mandatory category for which the AUAR is not applicable, so a much more industrial category generally, then you have to do that review. Even if your development scenario mentions that project, if it triggers a mandatory category, that has to be done, like an electric generator. Generally, the AUAR start with a plan and an order for review that's done by the local government. This tool is only available to local governments, if I didn't say that already. That establishes the boundaries and the scenarios. If there's something called a large AUAR, so there's a single big qualifying project, you do have to do a scoping process with public input before you do your order. Then you draft your AUAR documents, including the environmental analysis, which is meant to be kind of a hybrid of the EAW and the EIS. The content and format is similar to the EAW, but you get the EIS level analysis for the specific kinds of direct, indirect, and cumulative potential effects typical of the residential, commercial, warehousing, and light industrial development. And you also have to have a plan for mitigating the environmental effects. Then the responsible governmental unit, the unit that's doing that review, needs to publish and distribute the documents for a public comment period. They need to respond to comments, make revisions, and redistribute it. And then with the, once adopted, the AUAR is valid for 5 years. Again, just want to emphasize it's really important to think about applicability. The qualifying projects, commercial, warehousing, residential, light industrial. If they're included in AUAR, they're exempt from needing to complete their own separate environmental review if they were properly evaluated within the AUAR and the project doesn't trigger a separate mandatory category. Again, those more industrial types mandatory categories. And then if the actual development in total or in any of the sub areas is going to exceed kind of the maximum development that was studied, then the AUAR loses its validity as a substitute for an EAW or an EIS. And so the EQB, the staff recommend that the RGU ensure they include a development scenario that represents the maximum development or the worst case development that would be expected or allowed. Similarly, if some kind of environmental effect isn't covered by the AUAR, like a project is going to use more water than was reviewed, but not enough to trigger a mandatory category, it may no longer be valid, and then AUAR may need to be updated. And then permitting agencies need to be aware of that. So it's really important to think about these applicability and the validity of these AUARs. I think one of the things that's raising a lot of questions is that we have seen in the past year and a half, 2 years, an increase in the use of AUARs and a whole bunch of them that have development scenarios that might include data centers. They say where it's like technology park or things like that. It's hard to tell, but since the spring of 2023, we've had about 17, or maybe it might be, about 17 AUARs or AUAR updates, and then 1 EAW for a data center. And the little red flags are the ones that are currently under legal review. So some of the challenges is that, we have all these AUARs and they may well be applicable because under our rules, data centers are light industrial projects. But without information about specific data center projects and what it consists of, we can't fully identify if the AUAR is the only thing that is applicable and if it remains valid as review as the project fully develops. I think it's possible that some of these projects as they develop may need to do EAWs in addition to the AUAR that's been completed, or the AUARs may need to be further updated. Trisha just nodded at me, which is really good because she's worked on a lot of these. And so understanding that and what additional review might need to be done as the projects develop and come into focus is going to be really important. We're also seeing that they're going to have a unique combination of facilities that we don't necessarily deal with together. They're going to be maybe little energy projects attached with projects that go for review under other parts of the rules. And so pieces are being put together in new ways. And the idea is that you're supposed to look at everything holistically. Let's see, there's also, obviously, there's a lot of concerns about transparency and whether sufficient information is being provided in the documents. And that's been true for the AUARs and the EAW. What additional review or what overall review might be needed is likely to be highly influenced by the energy generation or production on site, the water supply and discharge, the storage of hazardous materials that might occur, and the building size. So that's some of the things that we're thinking about as we work to make sure the program meets all its objectives. And then what I would leave you with is we have an amazing technical assistance team. And if you call, they will help you. So please call and ask questions about the rules and ask for help with the process. And you can go to the project database and look how other people have done things. you can go to the monitor and see all the projects that are on public notice. And we're continually working on updating our guidance. So there's a lot of resources. And please, please, please reach out to us. Thank you.
All right, Q and A time. Do you want to do Q and A, Andy, or?
We'll get more shares for the U of M team and then.
Okay,
Then I'm just switching our slides.
Oh, all right, very good.
Give me the round.
Oh, you're gonna run, excellent, otherwise I can do that. Or I'm gonna pick people. Okay, okay, let's go start right here. And I'll let you know when time is used up for Q and A.
Okay. Andy's coming to you from this side.
Go ahead and stand up when I point to you.
Hi, I'm Martha Brown. I am a candidate for the Minnesota House running in 2026. I really appreciated this session. I learned a lot. I have a bunch of questions, but they're kind of rapid fire, short answers. So hopefully we can, I don't know if this is on, get to them.
I think
Um,
maybe just for
if
to
needed.
balance, let's do like one question.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we
Yeah.
have, but
Because we've only got like 18 minutes.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
so
And
your
the
most
most,
important one.
the most important ones, and Tricia, this is probably for you. Do we know as a country how many will ultimately be needed? Is it a finite number? Can they be upgraded as opposed to having to locate a new site? And can, I'm bunching them. Can wind and solar be a municipal requirement? And what about Freon as an alternative to water?
Yep. Do you want me to just shout it out or use the microwave?
Maybe we just keep one microphone up here. Yeah,
Maybe you're running all around.
okay.
Good question, thank you. Right now there is almost an insatiable demand as far as customers that need to use the data, so like the data centers customers, right? There is gonna come a point, we are in a boom of them, it is going to level out, right? I can't say, I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know when that is. This is just Tricia's opinion, this is not fact, but I mean, I think we probably have another 10 years or so of build out, my opinion only, until things start to stabilize. They are always being refreshed with equipment, so yes, they are reused. I mean, and they're really refreshed with equipment, sometimes every couple of years, every 3, 4, 5 years, right? So the same shell is being used and, you know, the more up-to-date technology is being put inside of them. So they are being used a lot. Yes, Freon and other ways of cooling are definitely being looked at and used in a lot of cases. And I forgot the last bit to that. That was 3 out of 4. Solar, yes, thank you.
The real question is, can they, depending where they're located, use their own, build solar farms and
Yes,
wind farms
we
to
are-
power
Okay,
themselves?
thank you. Actually, yes, and we are working on several projects like that, so we would call that behind the meter. So where the behind the meter, yep, where they would actually take some of the power directly. Now, and some of it's great to have some power that way. At this point, we still kind of need stable grid power. Batteries aren't quite battery chemistry isn't to the point that the duration is long enough to hold, you know, the sun if it's cloudy for a few days. You know, or if the wind generation isn't generating enough, like the data center does need very constant power. So it is getting closer to that, but even personally, I can say we're working on projects behind the meter that they will use renewables directly.
Okay, right here in the back row.
On a closed loop system, how often does the water need to be changed and what is done with the water from timer?
Take it out to me too. The answer you're not gonna want is it varies, because there's even multitude of closed loop systems, but I can give you 2 examples. I'm working on one closed loop system right now where it is actually never changed out. Now, you are gonna have some losses, you know,
the different bends and joints of the pipes, and you're gonna have a little bit of evaporative loss even within a pipe. So there we call it makeup water. So a small amount of makeup water is added, and a lot of times that's a mix of glycol and water as well. So that's added in. So a lot of times they're not flushed out at all. There's other designs and systems that might flush it out once a year. And it depends on, sometimes that's just water, sometimes it, like I said, it's mixed with glycol. If it's something that's mixed with something, it might have to go to, you know, a hazardous waste facility. If it's just water, it'll be filtered and cleaned, and if we're infiltrating stormwater on site, if it's a qualified site to do that, it would be infiltrated if it's clean water.
Center of the room, white shirt.
This is for Trish as well. So on the closed loop system, you had a slide up that said that, for like, I think 100 megawatt data center, it would be, the use of water on closed loop system would be about the same as 10 houses. I'm just wondering, is that the same amount that 10 houses use in a day, a month, a year?
Yeah, that was based on a day. Yeah, so that was somewhere around 3,000 gallons a day. And again, closed loop system, that's vast majority of that 3,000 is domestic toilets, sinks type of use.
Okay, back row, and then we'll come up here.
There's closed loop systems more, for 100 megawatts of capacity for cooling. About how much water does it take to fill? Do you have any idea on that, the initial fill?
Yeah, also varies, but I'm just gonna give you an example. A project we're working on right now, that's about 250 megawatts, is about 300,000 gallons.
Okay,
Hello, my name is Sue Betcher. I'm a Goody County teacher, and my question has to do with tax abatements. And I think you guys said don't give away too much, and can you give a ballpark about what you might consider reasonable, or what you see and what you see considered too much?
No. I can give you some example numbers. That's one of the places that we, you know, for example, 20 years is a really common time period used. Examples we heard of were 70%. You know, so one of the caveats that a lot of places told us was that they would use those kinds of abatements for first initial projects, get projects going, and then actually local incentives would diminish over time. So no, I cannot offer you that direct advice, but I can tell you that that was a common one that came up in our examples. Can you give any other examples aside from the 20 or 70%? That's what the one that comes to mind. But you know, we'll tell you that it raised, you know, in one state, you know, people say, well, this place did that, and they gave away too much. So I think that was the message, was make sure to do that calculation carefully, that you are having a financial benefit, even when you are thinking about something like that. Yeah.
another 10 minutes out there. if you
I'm
can.
just gonna say that I know that you're considering maybe local taxes, but the state is also offering these incentives, so it's probably good to look at the balance.
Next questions, we've got like another 10 minutes. Here we go in the back row.
Nancy Rappel from our County Environmental Services. Been doing this for about almost 30 years now. And I'm familiar with the EAW process and the EIS. And slightly familiar with the AUR. But I see that these data centers are really encouraging communities to do the AUAR. And I'm a rural planner, not a municipal planner, so I work in the county. And I can see the advantage if a community has set aside an industrial park to do an AUAR. But if a facility, a data center is looking to go look at an agricultural district, which the land uses are generally going to be agricultural, can you explain why would we want to do an AUR? Because wouldn't we be opening that up to kind of a different zoning capacity than what is intended? Does it kind of, you know, because if the data, so we might be going into a situation assuming a data center is going in there and we're looking at industrial purposes and focusing on that data center. But if they don't go in there and the land transfers, could we get some other industrial use going in there that was totally unintended?
So
the AUAR is really meant, right, it's gotta build off the comprehensive plan and it does have to fit with the zoning, and et cetera, and that's really unfortunately not my area of expertise, I'm learning more about it every day. It is only light industrial, so it does have to cover that, commercial, residential, warehousing and light industrial, so we wouldn't be able to cover like an actual industrial, like power plant or paper processing or any of those real industrial things, but I think it does provide some flexibility within like a comprehensive plan and with it fitting with a comprehensive plan to have multiple scenarios when you don't really know exactly what might come to fruition. I think that's one of the benefits that the cities and that are using it see, and I might just
Trish actually does that, so.
Thank you. Yeah, I can add on a little bit in the sense there's, well, to go back to what Catherine said up there, it's not an approval. So even if you're looking at other scenarios, you're looking at industrial, you're, looking at data center, you're looking at some other commercial, et cetera. The AUAR still does not approve the use whatsoever. You still have to go through all of your entitlements and local approvals as well. So you still have the, all of your zoning, your county zoning regulations, et cetera. And then, the other thing I'll say is kind of on the flip side is sometimes, their development is desired from an economic development standpoint. And so it's like, okay, a data center may or may not go here. And that's why a lot of times they're used is because we honestly don't know. We don't know, the developer doesn't know. It is investigating a piece of property to say, does this make sense or not? And hey, maybe if a data center doesn't make sense, maybe light industrial does, maybe something else does. And so that's why they are a good tool and communities often think they're
Okay,
positive.
I think that you're missing the point that I'm getting. So in the county, we have a comprehensive plan that, we set aside different districts for industrial, commercial, residential, and agricultural. A lot of times these data centers are coming into the county and they're wanting to go into an agricultural district. And they're wanting to use the AUAR where the zoning and the comprehensive plan said this is a farming type use area. And they're putting in a light industrial use in an agricultural zone. And so I'm concerned that when they do the AUAR for a light industrial, and when we as a community are looking at the site and we're thinking, and we're under the assumption that they're going to do this data center, and what if they back out of the property and now, because that was the one intended use that we were focused on as a community. But now we've opened it up to this AUR for other light industrial uses, or because like in EAW is very specific, this one use. We are reviewing this one use, and in AUAR, you're very broad. And so could you be opening up yourself in a community for unintended uses? Now, if I have an industrial area or an industrial park, and I have all these specified uses, I see that as a great tool to further industrial development in industrial districts. But some of these, as you say, are targeting areas where there's certain amenities that are there and they don't align with an industrial district. But that's my
So
concern.
we're gonna let the panel
I
respond,
just wanna
thank
ask-
you. Catherine, are you gonna be talking about AUARs more? Or is she?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so can you clarify this in yours?
Sure. I can stand up.
All right. Mine is actually on sort of the flip side of that question, which is with the AUAR and the environmental impact statement, isn't that the time for public comment and review and where the public can come forward with its concerns? And if the public if you don't know yet what the site is going to be used for, how can the public actually come forward with informed questions about the project and voice their concerns if they don't have that information yet?
Yeah, sure. I like to think about it as the AUAR when there's multitude of uses that could be put on there. Again, you're evaluating the site. It's an information gathering tool. It is a public process. It is the tip of the iceberg. There are several other public processes after that or under that, whether it's your local entitlements, As Catherine mentioned, likely other EAWs or EISs based on other mandatory categories, once that's known. But to guide land use and zoning, the AUAR needs to be done first. And again, it's just looking at, is this even relatively appropriate for this? So it's like it's the tip of the iceberg. It's the first step. And then when a project is defined, there is a lot more public involvement, both from a local level and a state level. So think about it as kind of layers of a cake. That's just the top of it.
We've got time for one, maybe two more questions. Okay, oh, I didn't know if you had your hand up. Yeah. Oh, let's go here. You have one.
So question would be the site selection, all right? And you can probably hear me anyways, but, so 10 megawatts, 20 megawatts, I know the community probably fits 100 megawatt site. How many acres do we need? And obviously the buildings change, you can stack them 2 floors, blah, blah, blah. What are you saying? Like, would you need 10 acres for 10 megawatts, 20 acres, whatever?
Yeah, a 10 megawatt data center, you're only talking a couple acres, right? Say 5 to 10 acres. If you're going up to 100 megawatts, do some quick math in my head, you're talking, call it 50-ish acres, maybe 50 to 75. 500 megawatts, you're up in the couple hundred acres. Does that help?
All right, one more. Over here in the.
Appreciate it. Mike Cypher, I'm here on behalf of Minnesota Farmers Union. I was wondering, you mentioned, Trish, that one of the goals of these technology companies is to be net positive within a certain amount of time. Could you address like the feasibility or the practicality of that and what that might look like, how that could be achieved?
Microsoft just announced that.
Oh, did they?
Yeah.
Look at Microsoft articles. Yeah, it took me honestly a while to wrap my head around this as well when I first heard that term. But it is that, and it may not be at the site, but in the community that they are cleaning up other water that otherwise would not be usable, or stream restoration or other things like that. So they're looking at the kind of water picture in the area as a whole. It's not just what goes through the pipes of the data center.
All right.
And I'm just gonna add that the total water footprint should be considered. Energy generation uses a lot of water as well. And often these water metrics are for just the on-site water use.
We are at break time for those that need to have refreshments or whatever needs to happen. And we'll get back together again at 3:00.
All right, thank you, everybody. I think we'll get started here. I know we're waiting on one of our presenters to plug in her car real quick. Which will be back momentarily. I've got a little bit of an intro anyway, so that's fine. My name is Sarah Murray. I'm the Government Relations and Policy Director at PURE, which is a rurally based nonprofit dedicated to protecting and restoring resilient communities and landscapes by harnessing the power of the people who care. Thank you. PURE has been actively engaged in the data center discussion over the last year and a half. We've intervened before the Public Utilities Commission regarding 600 megawatts of diesel-fired backup generation at Amazon's proposed data center in Becker, Minnesota. We were also one of the handful of organizations leading the conversations about data center policy at the Minnesota State Legislature last year. I saw Catherine there often. And while the legislature did pass some new laws, as she covered previously, regarding data centers, that was mostly around energy and taxes. So we believe there's a lot of work left to be done and are looking forward to continuing those discussions during the upcoming session, which starts next month. In the meantime, we're educating ourselves and others about key data center issues in spaces like this, and through our own data center webinar series, including one that might be of interest to folks in this room about community benefit agreements. That's on February 25th. If you want more information, you can find me later or just check out our website, curemn.org. Now that we've learned about some of the data center basics from that excellent first panel, we're going to be turning now to the tools communities might have available to them if they are approached by data centers or a data center developer and decide it's a good fit for their community. So we will be hearing from Tom Lambrecht, Economic Development Series Manager at Great River Energy. And then John Rademacher, the City Administrator of Cannon Falls. And I have started two series without her. She will be here momentarily. She is the Chief Executive Officer at MCEA, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. So I'm gonna have us get started. I'll invite, so, no, that's fine. So I'm gonna have, our presenters go, we'll just go right down the line, starting with John. If you can please introduce yourself, who you're with, and ways you're engaged with data center development in the community or the state, and in particular for you guys, if you can share about specific data center development, projects that you might be working on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sarah. So my name is John Rademacher with the City Administrator in Cannon Falls. I started with them in December 2024, and we have been specifically in conversations about a data center project. We have conducted an AUAR, we have done our formal land use approvals, we have done a development agreement, which incorporates some of those community benefits items that have had. And so I do have some slides. I mostly have them there in for information when you want these things later. But I think it'll be valuable if I kind of speak specifically about this data center project that we have. So we have been working with the developers tracked. They have other projects that they have been working with in the state. And the site that they are looking to develop this is a 250 acre parcel or combination of parcels that was just outside of the city limits of Cannon Falls. It has since been annexed into the city through an orderly annexation agreement with the township. And through that, there was a lot of discussions in terms of the existing land use that the township had for there, the existing land dynamics of what was developed around there, because there are some residential homes, and wanting to ensure that those homes were protected and that different things were made to protect those interests in this development. So that was certainly incorporated into our decision. So I'm gonna pull up this. So this is just the start of a couple of different slides. So from the time that the project was announced, which was October 2024, actually before I started, there's been a lot of different things that have happened. So, you know, for us in our city, this being kind of fairly new, there's no specific roadmaps or playbooks to kind of draw off of specifically in Minnesota, other than Rosemount, who is probably the only one in the state that has had something that's actually gone to construction this size and scope of data centers, despite, you know, there being data center development in the state for 20 years. So that was kind of, we're early. There was other projects that had already completed AUAR studies. There's others that had been engaged with other developments at the time prior to ours being. But for us, it was really critical, kind of at the forefront, that we laid out a few specific things. One, my predecessor administrator said we will not be signing any NDAs, that non-disclosure agreements. So that was first and foremost something that we weren't going to do. We operate in local government. We have data practice rules in the state. Those things we didn't feel were an NDA was going to protect against those practices, and it was something that was very familiar to our community. So we weren't going to do that. Not any city staff, not any of our consultants, not any of our council members. The other element that was really important when this started was our comprehensive planning, as it was talked about and discussed in the early stages, that for AUARs, they do need to align with the comprehensive plan. So our comprehensive plan, while it is fairly old, it was originally approved in 2003. It has been pretty accurate in terms of the future land use area for our community. And this specific area had been designated for industrial development. Across the street, kind of to the east and north, is the city's current industrial park, and that has been developed over that time since the comprehensive plan was approved, and this area was designated for that as well, even despite the existing residential homes in the township that existed or were developed even after that. So it is something for us that we felt for that site, which had actually prior to it been looked at for a different industrial development, one that came through the state. So that it was something that its proximity to Highway 52, its proximity to the large scale transmission lines, we knew that this site was likely going to be something that's industrial in nature. So it was, something was going to happen there. So we wanted to ensure, one, we're not being secretive, we're not trying to hide anything. There's a lot of information that we don't know or didn't know, or we're just getting into the early stages of discussions. So a lot of that was going to be fleshed out. But very early on, another big thing that happened was we were informed, and actually Trish was, we worked with her and the team from Kimley Horn, that we were likely going to have to do an AUAR for ours. And ours was going to be a large scale project. So we were going to need to go through the scoping phase as well as through the other public comment period. So it was, for us, it was known in advance, and those were the things that we were kind of preparing for. So we wanted to make that kind of very apparent early on. We talked about it in a number of council meetings. We did 7 different public joint work sessions with the city council and the planning commission, because we knew all of those would eventually lead to the point where we had approvals. And so that was something that for us, we knew we were going to have to go through that process. So public engagement was very important. We didn't do anything to, in my opinion, to try to discourage that. It was highly advised. We took comments even well after the comment period, and they noted them, and even got them submitted when we could, and getting them updated into our AUAR. So just to kind of drive home for us, those were the things that we wanted to do. You know, knowing what I know now, I absolutely would have done it again. And certainly would do some other things in addition to that, but that was really critical for us.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, and I've already jumped ahead a couple of questions I have. This is good. All right, go ahead, Tom, you want to introduce yourself?
Great, thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Lambert. I'm manager of economic development for Great River Energy, and we are based in Maple Grove. We are a wholesale power supplier to 26 electric co-ops across Minnesota. We have a number of components of development that we've worked on over the years, and data centers are certainly one of them. I'll give a little bit of an overview of who we are and some scope of our territory, but I also can talk about our specific role in some data center industry activities over the years. So one of the things that we are mostly a generation and transmission co-op. We are owned by those 26 member owners. One of them is in the audience here today, so thank you. But we are the wholesale power supplier to those and those distribution member co-ops and the transmission supplier. So any project that is served by one of our members, the bulk of that, the electricity comes from us, and there's different forms. Some co-ops have different structures where they can own some of their own self-generation, or they can partner with other partners in the mix. So the utility world is quite complex, but we have a number of co-ops that are engaged currently in data center activities. We've been inundated with requests over the last 5 years. And as Trish was mentioning, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we were very active in trying to recruit data centers, and the 5 megawatt data centers were very prominent of Northern Virginia and a lot of the ones in Ohio and Iowa and other states. They all had state programs, including incentives and just attraction strategies. And so I worked with the state of Minnesota, DEED office, and a number of other partners actively in that industry space, going around to talk to data centers. And of course, at the time, and even today, there are still data centers on that 5-10 megawatt scale. Those are still actively, there's 2 that have broken ground this year, or 2025, in our service area. And they're a very nice steady load for all of us for the electric grid. It's a great complement to the load curves that we normally see. And you can imagine, I'll spare you all of the engineering, but the load curves are a lot like this throughout every day, highs and lows and peaks. Data centers, of course, are just steady. That raises the average use of all people's electric usage for us, and it's more economical and more efficient that way. That being said, of course, nobody was probably too prepared to deal with hundreds of megawatt kind of data center requests. even though we knew they were out there, it's, in the last 3 years, we've received many gigawatt requests over our life, and gigawatts are extremely, 1,000 megawatts. 1,000 megawatts is, 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilowatt hours, so we certainly have, a scale of increment from a house where you might use 3,000 kilowatt hours a month. In a data center, these large hyperscales, you're gonna use, millions of kilowatt hours. So all those things scaled up, and mostly our role has been to work with our co-ops to identify or to help respond to those requests through what's the transmission capacity, what's the generation capacity, how do we best work with the community. We've worked in Cannon Falls for 15 years on these projects. We've worked in a number of other cities on projects around our service territory. And I'll get into some of our discussion on Q&A too, but that's kind of the level set of who we are. We're a not-for-profit cooperative, so we are owned by our members, our 26 members. They are owned by their members. Many of you might be members of, we don't serve this particular community, but we serve in Goodhue County, Steele-Waseca County, Dakota County. There's a whole bunch of, kind of southern Minnesota presence, Benco Electric, all the way over, and then we go all the way up to Canada. We have kind of go border to border in our co-op territory. Of course, we're dealing with power supply and all the other things that we as utilities have to deal with, but then we also are dealing with, of course, the legislation. Now, my one editorial on the Minnesota's legislation last year, of course, it does have some impacts on our energy side, but to me, it just provides a great expectation and say, here's what you have to do. Here's the clarity behind the water reporting, the energy reporting, all those things in the permitting process. Those are all very well defined in Minnesota. And so we're generally supportive. We don't have a lot of stake in that legislation, other than we think it's very good for the end user data center companies, at least to know what the rules are. So with that, I'll just go get on and we'll go Q&A.
Thank you so much. All right, and Catherine, I'm so sorry to get started without you, but if you want to just give a brief introduction to who you are, more about MCEA, and any of the specific kind of work you've been doing around data centers.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. And yeah, sorry about that. I got my car all plugged in, so that's exciting. I will make it all the way back to St. Paul in this very cold day. I'm Catherine Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. We are a nonprofit legal organization. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year, so we're 51 years old now. And we are the lawyers for in the environmental movement here in Minnesota. And so when there are communities around the state or groups that are facing environmental concerns, and they think, maybe I want to talk to a lawyer about this, they usually call us. And so we consult with groups around the state and communities. We may help them understand the law or understand legislation. We may help them lobby, and we may go to court. And we also work with the agencies quite a bit. So, we're blessed here in Minnesota with a wide range of environmental organizations. There's many of them. And often they're organized around a specific medium or area, right? So maybe they're an energy organization, and maybe they're focused on the Mississippi River or the Boundary Waters, right? And we're a little bit different in that we kind of plug in wherever lawyers are helpful. And that means that our lawyers do a lot of different kinds of work. So we have lawyers that work at the Public Utilities Commission, do a lot of work on utilities and the planning there, a little bit less with the co-ops because there's less jurisdiction there. We work on water issues, we work on mining, we work on, and I would say, like, sort of fundamentally, one of the roles that we see as part of our mission is defending and enforcing our bedrock environmental laws here in Minnesota. Many of which were passed about the time that we were founded, right? Like there was all of these laws passed in the 70s that are still kind of the most important laws we have today. One of those is environmental review. And environmental review is, Catherine Nusha gave a really nice overview, but I just want to step back a little bit and say, like, why do we do this? Like, what's the purpose here? And the purpose is, courts often refer to environmental review laws as the look before you leap law. The idea is you do a study first, and you understand, what are we doing here? What are the potential impacts? What are the potential benefits? Both are included in environmental studies. And are there alternatives, particularly in that EIS pathway? Are there ways that we could do this differently? Maybe it's a different location. Maybe it's a different design. Maybe it's different materials. What are the different alternatives we should be considering and comparing? And then you lay all that out, and the public can see what it is, and the agencies who have to make decisions can see all of that information, and we're all working out of the same sort of basis of information and transparency. And so our role here has been to look at these data center proposals and say, hey, are we following the law? Are we following both the purpose, but the spirit, right, and the letter of our environmental review laws? And we have concerns that we're not. And CEA has challenged 5 of the environmental review processes in cities across the state, because we think that those environmental review processes do not provide sufficient information as required by the law. It doesn't tell us, in some cases, what's even being proposed, or say what's being proposed, but without enough information about how much water it might use, how much energy it might use, what are the local concerns, and what are we going to do about those? Are there alternatives? And in general, what's inside the box, right? Like, we're going to build a big facility, but what's in there? Does it have a closed loop system, or is it using water chilling strategies? Are we, what kind of data center even is this? Is it for medical research, or is it for generative AI? Maybe we don't care, but it's helpful to know, right? Some people do care. All of this information is part of that transparency. And so we see that as our job here as the Watchdog organization. And I would say, to me, this is pretty fundamental to like local good governance and democracy, that we want to have this transparency, and we want to be able to know, just have the information to know what we're talking about, and that opportunity for the public to weigh in, opportunity for folks to influence it, and opportunity for the community to say no if they decide, you know what, this really isn't right for us. And so that's the way that we see our role as an environmental law organization within all of this.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all of you for that. I'm gonna go more on the staff now, you. So John, I'm gonna start with you. So you gave us a really good baseline on the process and involvement in the went. Can you specifically talk about how you assessed, either with the falls or, kind of like a developer or some kind of third party, how you assess the city's existing water, energy, and space to maybe accommodate a data center?
Yep. So one of the earliest things that we had was an agreement, an escrow agreement with our developer. And the basis of that escrow agreement was the recognition that this was going to be a very large and complex project, and that we would have a lot of needs, with the study, with evaluation of the environmental rules, the evaluation of development agreement, or legal team. So we wanted to have the capacity for this project, if we were going to go through a lot of that work, that the city wasn't on the hook for paying for the cost of our consultants to do this work. So that was the basis of the escrow agreement. Not long after the escrow agreement, when we started to try to understand, well, what is the scope of the things that you're asking for if this development is going to move forward? Why? What are the things that you would need from the city? It was brought up that potential access to water and treatment of water through our sewer treatment facility was going to be very important, and that was the really largely the basis of the annexation. So we wanted to understand what was the capacity that our city had. So we amended that escrow agreement to add in 2 studies. So we did a water distribution analysis study, so determining how much water do we have available, both on our permitted process, from what we can take out of the ground, because we do have 3 wells currently, but we have a water appropriation permit through DNR. So how much do we take out of the ground? what is the distribution of that water within our system? What treatment methods do we have to have? And what is the capacity for that infrastructure to serve a project like this? Additionally, we wanted to understand, well, what is our wastewater capacity? What do we have for a treatment facility? It was built in 2001, so it's getting older, but what is its capacity? How much can we treat? What can we take in? What are those volumes? What are the things that we could do with that? So, amended our agreement. The developer gave us the resources to fund those studies. We conducted that with an engineering firm that we work with, WHKS, and had those completed. So we had a very good baseline with scenarios of saying, here's what the city has. So we have a water appropriation of 250 million gallons a year from DNR. What are we currently using? What would we also want to reserve for potential future growth and development within our community if this data center doesn't happen? And to ensure that we have room to grow even without it, even with it, so that we're not sacrificing the future just to serve this one project. So once that was completed, we gave them kind of these results and said, here's the parameters. We have this many million gallons a year that's left after those things. We can treat this amount of water on a daily basis because those evaluations are a little bit different. So there's a little technical differences between what you're calculating both on water consumption and water collections for treatment. And if you can stay within these parameters, we can move forward with the next level of discussions towards development agreements. Or if you need more than this, then these are the things that are going to have to, the improvements that are going to have to be made, and we expect you to be paying for that. Also, very early on, we said we will not be doing any TIP agreements, any tax abatement agreements. That the development that you have, we don't feel is necessary, doesn't pass our what we would determine as the but-for test to do this. So you are on your own as a developer. We are not, we're not going to include or incorporate any of those things into the agreements. So ultimately, what came back was the capacity that we had. They did request that for up to kind of that maximum threshold for the water, which ended up being 41 million or 43 million gallons a year. And then they would meet our well under our daily threshold for sewer treatment for us to stay within our permits. One really important factor in our project that's kind of unique is that the site that they are looking at currently is an agricultural use, but identified in a comp plan for industrial. It does have an irrigation pivot irrigation system on that site that is permitted for 41 million gallons a year. So in the net impact of those two things, ultimately that 43 million gallons a year is actually based on a phased plan that wouldn't even trigger that maximum authorization for 10 years. So likely in the time from that field going away to the time that they're using the total water, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity there for less water to be consumed from this site than ultimately could be from the data center. We do have heard many times through both the developer, their consultants, other information and resources that are happening, that water use is becoming less in high demand for projects like these. So it could be the circumstances that at the end, they aren't even going to come close to using the total maximum of what water that's appropriated. But one of the things that we are willing to do that because we do have this capacity, it actually helps us as a distributor of water that we're selling it, that financially it could be more efficient for us to sell some of that capacity of water because it doesn't have a linear or parallel cost of operational expense, how much water we pump out of the ground and then sell through meters, the more water we use, so long as we're staying under those permits because we are fortunate that the quality of the water that we have access to doesn't need a lot of pre-treatment of any kind. So that's, and then our sewer plant, when it was built, was actually anticipated to be built for a larger community than what we are today. So some of the impacts of the early 2000s has caused our community to not meet the projected population growth. So we actually have capacity to pursue. So both things for us is why we're willing to make that available. For some communities, that might not be the case.
Great, thank you. All right, Tom,
From your perspective as a cooperative energy provider, how can communities be protected against rate increases in the event of data center development? I think just noting as we've heard previously, the laws that were passed this last year really only apply to investor-owned utilities. So I'm interested in particular about the co-op perspective here.
So, that is correct, right, but the one co-op, that of ours, we are not yes, co-op, we're not regulated. Or, we don't have to, we're not really regulated by the PUC, although we do have to get permits for certificate of needs and other, construction projects on our end. But the co-ops are independent, we are self-governed, so our distribution member co-ops are the retail arm of our delivery system, and they do set their retail rates. Our largest member co-op is Dakota Electric, which serves Cannon Falls, and they actually are rate regulated, so they're the one co-op that is rate regulated. And in fact, they did file, their PUC response, I think they were the first one to do it. They were all regarding this large load rate requirement. So they are protected in that regard, Dakota is. Overall, though, we as co-ops are not, like I said earlier, we're not for profit, so all of our delivery of electricity is really at cost, to the end user or to the member co-op, and then they share that down to the end user. We have clauses in our agreements, number one, that all electrical infrastructure that is coming from these large users, is 100% paid for by the data center or the developer. In the cases we're working on, actively, that's a requirement, so all the substation and interconnection and any transmission upgrades are assigned to those developments. And then, as you kind of mentioned, in earlier discussion, we aren't sitting on thousands of megawatts of excess capacity of power, just like no utilities are in Minnesota. And of course, we're very compliant with the carbon-free standards in Minnesota. We will meet that, just like every other utility will. So we aren't able to, or we're not considering adding any carbon-based generation from our perspective. And so new generation resources are going to be needed in some cases to pay for these, or to have generation capacity. But those costs, again, are gonna be borne by the developers of the data centers. We have essentially kind of no impact clause for our membership, that any impacts of these large users would be borne by those users and not by the ratepayers. That's been pretty standard in all of our discussions with the developers and with the data centers, and that's the way that our negotiations have gone. So from our perspective, we are covered both by the state of Minnesota law with regards to Dakota Electric, but our other members are also, and our governance is still guiding us to cover our membership and not have any rate impacts directly from this data center to those users. Of course, there's going to be rate impacts from all kinds of things in Minnesota, as you can imagine. There's power supply fluctuation in cost, and transmission requirements are probably the biggest source of our impacts of rates right now, and that's really just to build out the grid. We have a $1 billion transmission project that's going on. It's not related to data centers at all, and that's definitely going to have an impact on our membership, much greater than the cost of any of the specific data center projects that we're working on.
Thank you, Tom. I'm gonna go a little off script here. I'm so sorry. It's an easy, good question. So you're talking about how co-ops are unique, and really want to recognize that. I think one of the biggest parts of how unique co-ops are is just this opportunity for member owners to kind of be engaged and learn more. So can you speak just a little bit to what kinds of opportunities there are for folks if they have questions about data centers? How do they get more information from their co-op? And maybe a way that saves might not know.
Well, I mean, we have been engaged in a number of these types of events. We're very happy to be a sponsor of this, but we've done it very similar events in northern Minnesota and in western Minnesota, where we attend and are sitting next to our members at a number of open houses regarding, community type, information sessions on data centers. We of course have to do that for our own needs as well. We have, open houses on any kind of, our integrated resource plan, which is a thing we have to file every 3 years. We have a long history of being very transparent to our membership. And then we do a lot of education pieces with our members. Both, I think our first data center one-on-one session was in 2013, when our members came into the room and said, what are you talking about? What is a data center? Is that a computer? Is that a warehouse, or is it a library, or, what is this? So, we've done a number of things over the years where we've tried to educate and tell our members about them. But of course, everything keeps evolving rapidly. So there's, while we educate on how our power supply system will be developed and what we will do to meet our load growth, even I mentioned our integrated resource plan, we have to put some forecast of what we expect for load growth. And depending on, the feasibility or the realistic inquiries, I talked about earlier, all these requests we've been getting for gigawatts of new power. 90% of those projects are failed or gone away, or they're just kickers that are trying to, define the site or to call us from wherever, and then they say, well, we want 3-cent electricity, which of course is not. And outside of that, I will adamantly say that at least in my role, we have been very open and very, I don't want to use negative, but we are not a strong believer of the crypto mining kind of operations as a data center. They call themselves data centers. They're completely different. We do not work with them or have any type of economic development function on crypto mining facilities. And we frankly don't have any beyond somebody's garage that we don't really,
Perfect, thank you.
Put a lot of script there too, but it's not a data center.
Appreciate it, thank you so much. All right, Catherine, so you already described a little bit about MCEA's ongoing lawsuits in your intro. If you want to add any more flavor to that, you're welcome to, but my question is really more about, can you talk about MCEA's concerns with public disclosure and how cities are currently conducting environmental?
Sure, I can talk about that. I think there's a couple layers of some challenges that the current system has, some limitations. So the first one is that there really is no central permitting, there's no permit for getting a data center. So like we saw Trisha's slide that showed there's all these agencies involved, and that is for sure true. But it's really different than a lot of other large facilities. So if you wanted to build, a natural gas plant or large industrial or manufacturing facility, there's sort of an established permit path for those. You might not like it, but it's there, it's clear. But with data centers, these are new and there is no permit. Nobody says, here's your permit for getting a data center and here's, the requirements that we have associated with that. Instead, you've got, the city that makes maybe the zoning decision. You've got the Public Utilities Commission has, at least in one case and probably in others, asserted authority over just the generators out back, not the center itself. The Pollution Control Agency also is probably writing an Clean Air Act permit for those generators. Maybe they're writing a stormwater permit for runoff. You've got maybe the DNR looking at the water withdrawal, especially if it's groundwater. And so it's really messy. And I think, which is not great really for anybody, right? It's not great for the public. It's not that great for the developers either. And what's happening is that it really creates a very challenging situation in terms of transparency. Because without a good environmental review process, without a good study, there is nowhere where we take all the pros and cons and all the information and we put it in one place. And somebody in the last panel asked the question about well, isn't this our public comment period? And that's exactly right. This is the primary opportunity, and in some cases, for some projects, the only opportunity for the public to get involved and say, we want to weigh in, we want to influence this project, we want to tell you what we think is important. Now, Tricia said, well, there's other things that happen later, and that's true, but it's not, those things may not have robust public comment periods, or they don't have public comment periods at all. So for example, the DNR water appropriation, there's no public comment period for that. That permit will get issued and you will never hear about it. That's just the way that it's done right now. The air quality permit probably does have a public comment period. The PUC probably does have a public comment period. Although if you've ever tried to go in and engage with the PUC, I will tell you, it's not for beginners, right? But those agencies are only concerned about the thing that they have jurisdiction over. So if you want to go to the PUC, you have concern, you have questions, you say, well, I would like to know more about the water use, and I'd like to know more about electricity, and I would like to know more about the air emissions. The PUC says, well, we're only looking at box 2. We're only looking at the electricity, but only associated with those generators, not electricity demand, because the PUC is a demand side, not a supply side. So we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about these generators. If you want to talk about water, you have to go talk to DNR. And then if you want to go talk about air emissions, you have to go talk to PCA. So the process after environmental review, the opportunities in the process for public engagement get sketchy and they get complicated and they're not user friendly. So this is a really good reason to have that strong environmental review upfront associated with a singular permitting process, which is something that has been presented at the legislature and I hope will pass. Now, secondarily, we have this issue of the non-disclosure agreements, and I really applaud Cannon Falls for choosing not to sign those. Some cities have decided to do non-disclosure agreements. You do not have to, it's not required. And some cities, in fact, have policies that say, you know, we don't do this. But what's happened in the places where they do it is that the conversations are happening with the proposer, with the developer over a period of time, sometimes more than a year, and the public is not being told what's happening. And that's not a great process for local governance. It's not a great process for democracy. And in particular, what we see is those non-disclosure agreements might still be in place at the time that the AUAR is written. And when those AUARs are very vague, and they don't say, for example, that a data center is being proposed, at the same time that a non-disclosure agreement is in place that says the city official, right? And so there are proposals for legislation. My personal opinion is that we should say elected officials can never sign non-disclosure agreements because that's just private lobbying. We can't have that. And that government officials, city employees can, but that those should be done no longer in effect by the time the environmental study starts, because by then we want to be sharing information and not withholding information from the public. I think that would be good public policy. All of that said, as cities, you don't need that legislation. You can just choose to do these things on your own. Those non-disclosure agreements.
Thank you. Perfect. I'm gonna jump ahead to our final question. You guys have been giving such great answers. If you can just kind of go there, we'll start with Kathleen this time, and we'll come back this way. Any final thoughts, strategies, resources for how all of these different, movers and these puzzle pieces come together to developers, cities, community members, and how can they work together to ensure that if development comes here, it's moving forward in the best interest of the communities.
So probably I sound a bit like a broken record, but I do think that the best strategy for data centers over a certain size, because some of them are still fairly small, but these larger hyperscale data centers is to all go through the environmental impact statement process. It should be a mandatory EIS category. The difference between the EIS and the EAW that you saw on Catherine's slide is that those EAWs don't have alternatives, and the EIS does. And so what that means is with an EIS, we're doing a full and robust study, and we're looking at different ways of designing this data center. Because we hear a lot about, oh, we can make this more energy efficient. We can make this more water efficient. We can do a closed loop system, and that's great, right? The tech industry is making investments in these advancements, and we know that the tech industry is very capable of being innovative, and these innovations are being investigated. Let's put them on the table, and let's let Minnesotans decide in their communities which one they want to see come into their community, which makes sense for them, because we also know there are trade-offs, right? Something that's more that's less water intensive is going to be more energy intensive, et cetera. And so those are choices that we should be able to make here in Minnesota. The environmental impact statement process, the other thing that's really great about it is that it brings in the various agencies as cooperating agencies who also have a stake, right? And so if you have, you usually have a lead agency, and then then other agencies that also have to issue permits or get involved, sort of get invited in to consult in a good EIS process, which, by the way, the developer pays for that. This is not paid for by you, the taxpayer, by law. The developer pays for an environmental impact statement. And so that means you've got local folks and state folks all in one place. Because we are looking at statewide impacts here. Absolutely, the community has a stake in a data center and what it looks like and how it's designed, absolutely. But it's not just a local issue. Because of the water issues that we've heard discussed, where you've got surrounding communities that are pulling from the same aquifer, and because of the statewide energy issues, those are things that deserve scrutiny from state agencies. I do want to pause here and talk just a little bit about the energy issue, because we haven't talked about that very much today. And I think it's an important one. There is a statute in Minnesota that says we have a goal, or it's arguably a requirement, but in any event, a goal to be carbon free by 2040. And so, and we're doing well on that, to be clear. We're 50% approximately renewable right now. Some of our co-ops and utilities are even doing a little bit better than that. Simultaneously, though, we have right now with the Public Utilities Commission, both Xcel Energy and Minnesota Power, two of our largest utilities, proposing to build gas plants, new fossil fuel facilities, specifically to serve data centers. And they're saying that in the dockets, we know it to be true. Well, how is this happening? We have a 2040 carbon-free law. Well, the reality is that utilities have an obligation to serve. What that means is anybody who wants to plug in, they have to serve them. You can't say no. You can't say, you know what, you're too big. We don't have the energy today. We can't service that. You have to serve them. And so utilities are only reactive in the situation. They have to respond to the demand that they foresee. Building up fossil fuels, building up a gas plant is financially advantageous for an investor-owned utility, differently situated than the co-ops, because they actually get a guaranteed rate of return. And we, the ratepayers, are paid for that. If you are obviously within that investor-owned utility. At the same time, 2040 is feeling like kind of a long way away if you have increased demand from data centers today. And so they're proposing those gas plants in order to service data centers. And by 2040, they will either close those and make them stranded assets that we all pay for, or more likely, they will buy renewable energy credits, which is an option in order to comply with 2040. And that's basically, we'll continue to burn gas or coal, but we'll just try to buy credits from some other part of the country. Okay, sorry. So I'm getting the sign, but yeah. All of this is to say, like, these are big statewide issues and they deserve a big statewide conversation. And that's why that EIS process that brings in all these agencies is really, in my opinion, the way to go.
And then depending to see if all these guys to look that quick, 2 minutes. Wait, 1 minute, go. If you have any final thoughts.
Well, I thank you for bringing up this obligation with Sarah piece. That is certainly something that we're on top of as well. And obviously we have to serve, our role necessarily isn't advocacy, other than we know that there's areas where there are lacking development opportunities or job opportunities or housing opportunities or
young family, staying in the area opportunities. So we believe firmly in the economic vitality of the state as well as the environmental protection of the state. And that is one of our co-op principles. We are focused on making sure that we have, I very much appreciate the sustainability goals and the legislation. As you know, we have a very demonstrated commitment to environmental design and building, and our first LEED Platinum building in Minnesota, and still very much focused on protecting environmental standards and stewardship. That's mostly out of our control as far as what the developer does, but we can certainly incentivize and promote those opportunities, and that's what we do with a number of our programs in economic development, which is relying on sustainability goals or energy efficiency standards.
Okay, 1 minute, I'll give a quick go up through my. So if you're a city or local government or somebody that regulates this, I think if you get a proposal, be early to establish what your non-negotiables are. What are your standards? What are the services that you're willing to provide to a certain limit? What are the benefits that you really want to see come back to your community? And have those outlined and be very transparent and clear with the developer in those conversations. That is something we as a team push for very early, and often would leave the conversation saying, if this isn't going to work for you, let us know right away, because we don't want to waste any of your time. So having that in front is really important. So one item of community benefit that came out of the project that I wanted to make sure was addressed is the area that the project will be in is not actually in Cannon Hills School District. And that was a huge contentious issue when this was brought to light. And so the developer came up with a plan to provide them with a payment in lieu of taxes. So that would offset, they're still going to pay the taxes to the school district that they're part of, which is Randolph, but they're also going to pay this additional benefit to our school district to kind of in lieu of, hey, we're building this big thing, it's going to be in the city, but it's not part of the tax benefit of the school. We're still going to make sure that you have the opportunity to benefit from it. And last, understand the timeline is long, it's constantly going to change. I put out versions of my timeline. I think I ended up with like 12 different ones, because as every one deadline moved, so no, there's all these other. I hear the consolidation of the rules that's not in place yet. So get to know what those rules are. Make sure you have good consultants that tell you what agencies have what rules and when the deadlines are, and what rules you have with your own the statewide too for your own rulemaking process. So know what they are so that you get them done in advance, because that's the number one thing I told the developer in our conversation is we are not skipping a step. We're going through every process, we're gonna follow the rules, we're gonna go through every timeline, every scoping document, every public comment period, every publication for a public hearing that we have, we're gonna meet it and we're gonna follow it. And so every time something moves, all those other deadlines move too. So stay on top of that.
All right, thank you. Lots of good discussion. I think we still have time for questions. Okay, perfect, good. Should have had Brenda. Okay, and you can help out that? Okay, perfect. So 1, 2, 3. And then we'll try again.
This question's from Tom, based on Catherine's comments. So it seems like you're under a lot of pressure. It's like you have a great opportunity here to serve more clients, bringing in revenue, but you also have to meet the 2040 renewable energy. How do you think you're going to balance those two competing demands?
So again, I'll start by saying we're a not-for-profit member, so we have members that govern our rates that have growth overall. I would say that our strategy is not to grow as big as we can. Certainly that's not our model of what we believe in. We are not required to have a rate of return to anybody other than cover the cost. We know there's pressures on rates in general, and we try to be good stewards of that and manage that to have as little rate impact as we can on any of the data center growth. What we are doing, just for power supply questions, is we are limiting in what we have available, and we are generally requiring that these large users bring some of their own resources to the mix. So we're not adding resources to save them. They typically are being asked to do that, and we will be part of that whole transaction, but we're not adding generation of gas plants or anything other than we are adding probably 800 more megawatts of wind in the future for our own use. And that was one of the considerations too, was we're not going to compete with, any data centers need to go out and build more wind farms. You know, we have our own portfolio that we need to meet the 2040 standards, and that's what our plan is to do. And that's, as the new ones come on, we're looking for partners in that user with that developer, us going out and building that.
This question is for John. So obviously, you know, I know in Cannon Falls, there was quite a bit of pushback there for a little while from opposition groups within the community. I guess sort of a loaded question here, but you know, what were some of the biggest things you were hearing from those opposition groups? And then can you kind of describe your public outreach strategy and you know what worked for you guys?
Yeah, so the main issues were on the water use and concerns that we were going to use a vast amount of water and it's going to have a broader impact outside of our region. That was something that we looked at and studied with our water study. It was conversations that we had with DNR, and then it was you know, looking at, well, what are these existing facilities or what are some of these facilities doing? You know, so those were really spelled out by setting cap on in terms of the total annual water appropriation that we would agree to. Looking also to the circumstances of the land and having the irrigation permit there and understanding the dynamics of the aquifer in the region. So I want to give a big credit to the Kimley Horn team that gave us the presentation and looked well beyond our just city into anywhere that, you know, potentially this volume of water that we were supplying could impact that, and understanding where that water was coming from. Because as Carrie presented, it comes from a lot of different sources depending on what level that you're in. So where we were at in the Jordan aquifer, and where a lot of the very concerned ones were people out in the township, you know, rural folks that weren't on city services, have their own wells. They were not in that same aquifer. So the direct impact to them was unlikely to be, you know, noticeable or there. So based on the information that we were, so I'm not an hydrologist, I'm not an expert, but that was what we had, and having that same ask to DNR and having them confirm to us to say, hey, this isn't going to, that won't take place, gave us a lot of assurance moving forward. The other piece was related to the power, and Dakota Electric, who is one of the co-ops with Great River Energy, will be the power supplier. So they actually had representatives come to our council, speak in a public joint work session to the council and talk about their strategy and procedures, and very much confirm the same things that Tom just said, that their costs are going to be, any costs for this development, both transmission and power generation, are in their agreement borne by the developer and the investor. So that they're to maintain or sustain that commitment, that this isn't going to have a negative impact on the existing users' rates. Another factor is that we are split. We're actually not entirely served by Dakota Electric. A portion of this project is much more of our community in a residential city is served by Xcel. So those users are going to have different impacts. So there could be the potential in the future of Xcel's decisions and things that they're impacting being different from what actually happens for the portable. So that was a big part of it. So then how did that get presented? You know, this was the area that I wish we could have, knowing a lot more of this, I wish we could have had a lot of those finer details known earlier on. It took a long time to kind of get through everything just based on knowing where we need to be with our rulemaking and the other things that we get to follow. But once we did know that and were able to present definitively, hey, these are the terms of development agreement, that was the presentation that we made to the council, that also got reported, that also got talked about in a lot of different areas. We posted those things on our website. We have a lot of information that we've added to the websites and everything, both from us as a city and our developer partner. with that information. I didn't turn down any phone calls from residents that I know of or aware of that had questions. I had individual sit downs with people. We had other community engagement sessions hosted by the developer and other opportunities for not just, find public hearings based on statute, but every public forum, every public meeting that we had for planning commission, city council is public forum, and anybody was welcome to speak. And those questions that were generally asked at that, we did actually go out and try to address them within those meetings too. So I think for some of the answers to that, a lot of community members have spoken to me after the fact and said those were very valuable. We learned a lot just by taking the time to answer those questions.
We're gonna bundle 2 questions and then, okay, never mind. 1 question, then we're gonna start fresh with raised hands.
I think this question is for you, John, or anybody else from either panel. But when you're talking with a developer operator, is there a rule of thumb, say like per megawatt of data center capacity, or how many $1 billion of investment? How much do you think you can go back and ask them for community benefits, or where do you get to the breaking point where things that you ask for, they just say goodbye?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if there's a real linear or proportional comparison to their total investment in the project or how many megawatts it's going to be. I think it really focuses on what you need for the community. Another element is all the infrastructure to serve the site, the mains water mains, sewer mains that are going there, any road, right-of-way access, road improvements, all those various things are all borne by the developer as well. There's one element in our development agreement that we approved that is at a certain point of when they go vertical with construction and file a building permit, that they will pay the city $5 million, and that's due for the construction of a water tower. That likely at the time is likely 4 years from now. And it's reasonable to presume that in 4 years, a $1 million gallon water tower is going to cost more than $5 million. We're aware of that, our developer was aware of that. What we asked for was what was fair. And what was fair was how much capacity are you asking for? We put into that agreement, and how much is that a part of our total system? So what we determined was if you're asking for this, and the terms we ended up with was about 80%, if you're asking for that, then you should pay up to 80% of what we envision this cost to be. The rest of it also is going to serve and benefit the community as a whole. And we were already planning for making improvements, but we wouldn't have put a $5 million or $6 million or $8 million water tower. We would have renovated something else for far less. So because you're here, because you're willing to make this payment, we can do more and and leverage the money that we would have had to kind of fill the gap. So look at what you have for capacity, what you have for needs, and ask from that from the developer. And if there is going to be a breaking point, and I think you do have to say, hey, we're not going to bend and ask from our residents or our users to cover your costs to serve your project.
And just on the note of time, I know we are past the 4 p.m. If you are able to stay, we'll do more Q&A, and then we'd love to kind of hear from you on that meter piece. So I think probably we may go till 4:15 if you are able to make that.
Hi, so my name is Angie Hansen, and I'm running for Minnesota State Senate. So I'm just here to learn today, and thank you all for all the good information. But I have a question, and you might not be able to answer it, so maybe you can send it, I don't know, for Catherine and Sarah. I'm just mostly interested in new legislation that you think would uncomplicate things and help Minnesotans. So that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, thanks. So there's a bunch that is on the table for this session. Our primary goals are the mandatory EIS requirement for data centers over certain size. The central permitting process, we'd really love to see that. The limitations on the non-disclosure agreements for local city officials, as well as some guardrails around water sustainability use. Facilities, ensuring that if there's additional energy infrastructure that has to be built, that it is carbon free, it's clean. and that they're paying for it. There is some legislation in place on that. And the PUC is looking at that, but there could be more clarification around clean energy or carbon-free energy in particular. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think. We're working with Senator Ian Johnson Stewart, Senator May Quaid, Senator Jen McEwen, on the Senate side. And I'll have to get back to you on the reps because they're not coming to me at the moment. We have folks in the House side as well. Obviously, this is still a very divided legislature. You know, what, if anything, gets passed, I think is a, big question mark for everybody this session. That said, I do think the data center issue has had a more bipartisan support than some of the other issues we've worked on. And it is because, there's so many proposed, they're in all districts, right? It's not a Republican or Democratic district necessarily. And a lot of senators and representatives are getting calls from local constituents. And so I think there are a lot of questions and concerns and opportunities for clarity. Yeah, thank you. Patty Yukon absolutely has been a great champion.
Yeah, here and then maybe, yeah. I'll see if there's time.
Thank you for your time presenting today. Really appreciate the information. If this is appropriate for this or applicable for this panel, I'm curious, what are the cost and schedule comparisons among the AUAR, EAW, and EIS? So just like each of those in comparison, what's the cost investment and what's the timing from a month standpoint or annual standpoint?
It varies quite a lot, because the requirements of the AUAR, the EAW, and the EIS are like minimums, I guess I would say. And in terms of the cost, it varies quite a lot. And people can choose to do more, can be more robust. And so you see a wide range of types of AUARs, types of EAWs, types of EISs. EISs, I think it's probably fair to say, I'm guessing, are typically the most expensive because they're the most robust. Kind of looking at Catherine and assuming that's true. There is a statutory mandate of 280 days on the EISs. And if you look at, I think, sometimes people have this kind of reaction to the EIS because they're worried about the time and the bureaucracy associated with it, as well as the cost. And I will say that, and we don't do a ton of EISs in Minnesota, pretty much only the ones that trigger the mandatory categories. But I will say that, like, if you look at the reporting from our state agencies, the Pollution Control Agency and the DNR on the permitting process that includes environmental review, they're meeting those statutory timelines the vast majority of the time, like 99% of the time. Yes, there are outlier projects like sulfide mining that take much longer, but it doesn't have to be that way. And for many of the entities that we're in litigation with, honestly, by the time we get done with litigation, they could have done an EIS in that 280 days, right? So there are costs associated with it and there's time associated with it, but it's a strong tradition that we have in Minnesota that we study these projects before we move forward. And so I like to think that the companies that come here that will be most successful will be the ones that want to make that upfront investment in that community engagement and good environmental studies before they get started, even when it is pricey.
I just want to add to that. For us, the city directly didn't pay for anything. That was the developer cost to submit for the AUAR. I feel our AUAR was much closer to an EIS level review than it was, say, the EAW. There's the alternative, it ended up being 460 pages, I think, of documentation plus comments that were incorporated at the end. So there was a lot of valuable information that we used as a city to help guide our regulatory process. We took information and feedback from that AUAR process to ensure that when we made our land use and development agreement approvals, those things were considered. So that helped us, and that wouldn't necessarily be align with the timelines if, EIS was mandated for this project. We had some things that we did have to change. We did do an ordinance amendment to incorporate data centers as a conditional use. So we were able to take that AUAR information and incorporate that into our regulatory.
Last question.
It's more of a philosophical question, so I just want to tell everyone here at some time. And so, you said something that's, I'm still like astounded by. I thought a data center just like process data. And I heard that there are different kinds of data centers today, so I know that this, because we have 13 seconds left. My question maybe to John specifically is, what kind of data center is Cannon Falls going to have? And then maybe the larger question is, how does a city allocation, whatever, decide what kind of data center they would have?
And I will do my best to wrap this up in about 30 seconds because this came up in our process. For us as a city, what we have jurisdiction over is the land use decision. So what is a building? Where can it set? How big can it be? What sort of architectural standards does it have to meet? That's the regulation. So I use the metaphor of, well, we can regulate a restaurant, and by telling it, here's your building, here's what you can build. You have to go through the permit process and building permit to make sure you meet all the state codes, and you have to do that on the food service side, and you gotta follow the state rules on that. But we as a city aren't gonna tell you what to put on the menu. So that was kind of our statement. Now, philosophically, do we like crypto mining? No. So I'm really happy to hear Great River Energy is supporting with that. So that is something that's not likely to be. The questions were asked of the developer as well. But to answer the specific question, do we know? We ultimately don't. This is a developer that's preparing a site that they're ultimately going to sell to an end user. And that end user could be one of the great big data companies that exist in the world. And they may have a different use. But at this point in time, we can't say definitively what it's going to be, and we haven't said definitively what it can't.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, everybody, for sticking with us. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the great Q&A, and then we'll go back to Benji.